Introductory disclosures. I am collaborating professionally with both Vielight and Brainmaster, and you're going to see me use their, you're going to see me talk about and refer to various products in their product lines because those are the ones I'm currently using to develop on. Also, I am very excited about many of the potential variety of industry products out there, and I do think some of the principles could be applicable to other products as well. Some of the things I'll say will be Vielight specific just because of the operational principles of their equipment, which I will try to clarify when that is relevant. Here are my just general goals for today. I want to talk about what you can do just with photobiomodulation by itself. I want to talk about some of the newer things that have come out in the last year-ish and some of the stuff that is coming. I also want to discuss how to integrate concurrently or sequentially photobiomodulation and neurofeedback together in sessions or over a treatment arc so you guys can really get the best bang out of the devices that you have regardless of what type they are. One of the things I've been doing for a while is using EEG equipment to drive and modulate photobiomodulation and or other types of neurostim in real time. So I'm absolutely going to talk about what I'm doing these days with that. And all of the skeptical, controversial questions or opinions that you guys have, do feel free. I am essentially co-creating emerging science with you. It's the practitioners out in the field like me who are taking the equipment and trying it out in different case contexts and then essentially recording and documenting and pattern recognizing over time that is adding to this new emerging body of science. So I want to do a combination of referencing some literature we already have out there, and then just the majority of what I'll show you will just be data I've gathered firsthand and some of the principles I'm beginning to extract from it. I will also mention we've got Dr. Lu Lim with us, and so if there are any really specific technical questions, I may potentially ask him to weigh in, and I might also simply request some of his input at different points during the workshop if I feel my technical expertise is hitting the wall, which it does occasionally when we do things like particle physics and how did we build this particular piece of equipment. What I will do contextually is discuss, so in the wide available options in the industry and then subsequently in the Vielight product line, there are a lot of different devices. I'm going to cherry pick 3 to talk about really easy gateway drug entry level all the way up to what is very kind of complex and requires maybe a little bit more enthusiasm about options as opposed to panic attacks about a variety of options and customizability. Do not feel bad wherever you are on the spectrum. We've got something for you to talk about. The 3 main elements I'm going to discuss are the multimodal intranasal. So this little device right on the far left, tiny little box like this, and then a couple of intranasal LEDs that come out of it that I believe is probably one of the most economical and effective ways to get started in photobiomodulation. You're going to hear me really lean into the intranasal input element of photobiomodulation for a lot of reasons today, which I will go into detail about. The second one I would consider maybe a median range is that Neuro Duo 4 line, which gives you 4 transcranial LEDs, 1 at the cerebellum, and then 1 in the nose. The last one is the Neuro Pro 2. I will also discuss some of the fancier, complex, customizable elements around the Neuro Pro 2. This one has 10 transcranial LEDs, 2 in the nose, and all of them are fully customizable, each LED independently. So you can do pretty much anything you want with that Neuro Pro 2, which I believe might really be like the most advanced photobiomodulation device we currently have on the planet. That sounds very dramatic, but I'm pretty sure that's true at this stage. The layout for consideration is going to be, you have people who potentially come into your office to do sessions with you. You have people that you may wish to suggest that they purchase devices and take them home and use them in between sessions. There's a lot of reasons why you would do that. For many people, not always being able to come and be in office with you, who can't necessarily come in and be with you very frequently. So if you've got people who are far away, but they really want to work with you for their expertise, we're going to discuss a little bit about things they can take home and use, and maybe come in and see you every 90 days or every couple of months to do either a check-in or a brain map or whatever it is that you guys do for your assessments at the beginning and ongoing through the treatment arc. So we'll talk about what can they potentially take home and what does that look like. And then we will talk about the idea of essentially they come in to see you, and so you're using all the devices in session. Maybe they can come in a couple days a week. Does it make sense for them to do everything in session, or do you still want them to take things home for additional support? And then we're going to talk about within session the differences between maybe doing sequential and concurrent. Sequential meaning you do stuff in a row. First you do some photobiomodulation, then you do some neurofeedback, or vice versa. Or you put the photobiomodulation on, which is completely independent of the neurofeedback, that you could do concurrently at the same time. Why would we care about that, and how would we customize neurofeedback to get the most out of that option? That's what we're going to discuss. Stuff through the nose. As you guys probably know, the idea of giving practitioners that come in, giving them something to put up their nose and then turn on, has a certain amount of natural pushback. I don't think everybody loves stuff up their nose. One of the reasons that it is, if you're gonna do photobiomodulation, I'd strongly recommend that you consider an intranasal option of some type. Who has heard of the cribriform plate? Essentially, that little guy that protects the cortical elements of your brain, the olfactory bulb, everything that's essentially brain that is behind your sinus cavities. Right? So it's not just, oh, you have holes in your skull and then it's straight into the brain. No, you've got a few things in between. The cribriform plate is one of them. It's quite porous. And so one of the things that allows us to do is put light directly in, as directly as we can, through that cribriform plate to that olfactory bulb, and then really to connect with other elements in the brain. So I am going to talk more at length a little bit later about what that means, but part of what I want you to start to keep in mind is that essentially limbic network that is connected to those olfactory inputs, and how much of that insula, prefrontal cortex, even amygdala elements, those inferior temporal, all of that stuff, that the hypothalamus, the perihippocampoid gyrus, all of that stuff that when we're discussing, oh, we're gonna do neurofeedback, the neurofeedback that we do, unless you guys are sticking electrodes into the brain, I am not, I'm staying surface. Pretty much all of the EEG that we're recording and interacting with is pyramidal cortical, which means that there is a certain amount of limitation to how deep in the brain we can image. I am going to discuss some S-Loretta options later, some source localization or current source density options that lets us potentially identify and grab stuff on the bottom of the brain. But most of the time when we're thinking maybe 2 or 3 or 6 neurofeedback surface EEG options, we're talking about that upper cortical pyramidal neuron activity. Now, what we do know is that everything in the brain is connected. So you can't change one little spot on the top without potentially changing everything down through the brainstem and back up. Like, it's all interconnected. But part of what we're trying to sort out is how can we most effectively impact some of those lower brain regions, even though we are using external non-invasive techniques. So one of the reasons I want you guys to start thinking about intranasal as a really solid option is if you're putting stuff only in the nose, you can put pretty much anything else you want across the head EEG-wise, and you don't have a lot of interference. The other thing that you can consider is that when we are discussing what most people come to you for, what are the big categories, right? They come to you because they can't do things that they want to do, or they can't stop doing things that they don't want to do. There are usually elements of cognitive, and almost always neurofeedback is going to have some cognitive function element. Although with the photobiomodulation, and even some with some of the neurofeedback options we have, like infra-low and infra-slow, there is more sort of brain-body juncture impact. So people who are coming in with potentially dysautonomia and chronic fatigue and things like that, it's not impossible that we can support and help recovery in those stages as well. But we all know that, to a degree, the cortical cognitive functional elements of neurofeedback is really where the EEG stuff shines. It's a bit of a dice roll how much we can help with full body stuff. Obviously the central nervous system does run the body, and I have had some very unexpected top-down effects doing neurofeedback with people where there have been obviously a third of the serotonin that you make is in your gut. There's clearly enteric lining, neuronal lining, mirror behavior activity in your gut to your brain. We talk a lot about gut up to brain. There's a lot of brain to heart and brain to gut activity as well. But mostly we hang out in, can you focus? Can you sleep? Can you remember things? Are you having trouble with, state flexibility? Too much anxiety? Not enough engagement? These are the categories we typically hang out in when we're talking about doing neurofeedback. So I'll probably stay mostly in those, and then I might grab Lou at some point to talk about the long COVID stuff you guys have been doing with I may pull him in occasionally to weigh in on how you guys can think through this. But what I want you to do, as we're talking about everything and looking at the setups of the different devices, is to consider if it's possible for me to get some direct bottom of the brain activation, some limbic system, amygdala level activation, while I'm potentially lining myself up for, or maybe at the same time even doing some higher cortical pyramidal feedback options, how do I put that together to really make things go? Why am I excited about a few $100 device where you can put stuff in your nose? Well, so let's say you're doing absolutely nothing but the little handheld dual intranasal option. So one of the things you can consider is it does come with a couple of different LEDs. The ones that I'll probably talk about the most are going to be the 8-10 nanometer ones, and that is because you can actually buy any combination of the LEDs you want. So you can buy like the full set or just the device that runs it in two 8-10 LEDs. These ones, you can toggle them to pulse at 10 hertz or pulse at 40 hertz. There is a limited pulsing, there's NIR, near infrared, and then there is pulse PNIR, pulse near infrared. So the 8-10 nanometer wavelength itself has its own inherent potentially useful therapeutic impact. But when you turn the 8-10 nanometer wavelength off and on a number of times per second when you pulse it, those of us who have some history in EEG know that there are functional correlative states, essentially tasking states, that we can associate with different EEG frequency speeds. So for example, the 10 hertz alpha or the 40 hertz gamma, either one of those could create or recruit a certain amount of frequency following effect that helps somebody either hang out more in an alpha range or potentially hang out more in a gamma range. And we're going to talk more about how that's relevant. You can absolutely purchase any combination of these because the other wavelengths, the 633 nanometer, the 655, and the 470, the 633 and the 470 are both LEDs, and then the 655 is a cold laser, which also, that one makes the most light. When I plug that one into my mom, she lights up like a Rudolph, and then she sends me pictures, which is hilarious. I just never know when she's gonna spam me with like Rudolph mom face in my phone. My mother's actually been using this little guy for the last 2 years, and I genuinely believe that this is part of the reason that, in spite of her being ill a few times and being somewhat advanced in age, bless her, bless all of us, we're all getting there, I think that there has been some very encouraging maintenance of her memory and cognitive function that I think a couple years ago I was seeing more slide than I'm actually seeing now. Is there any better recommendation than I made my mom use this? Every day she uses the 810 at 10 hertz, and she also uses, she will alternate between the 655 laser and the blue. So anytime she goes out, she'll use the blue and the red. And part of this, I'm looking for that potential impact of reducing viral load and reducing possible inflammatory response. I would not consider this to be a preventative. I would not, obviously not a doctor, but one of the things we're trying to do is just add stuff into the routine for people. We know that we are living in exciting times and there are a lot of developing viral and microbial and bacterial experiences happening and mutating and coming online for all of us potentially. So to whatever degree we decide to do some mitigation, either preventative mitigation or potentially even treatment post-viral impact, we're trying to think through what are the things that can reduce viral load. So if you go out and you're around someone who's coughing in your face and you come home and potentially run this, my recommendation is maybe run it about 10 minutes, swap nostrils and run it about another 10 minutes. Because that's the other fun thing is you can actually move them back and forth so that you can get both sides. Now, so the little 633, I have also seen some really surprising, I keep saying a little, they feel quite diminutive as we move forward and talk about other bigger, fancier options. But I have been honestly really surprised over the last couple of years when I have seen people have strong responses to just the intranasal. I really shouldn't be that surprised. I literally told you about the cribriform plate being porous and it basically hitting your limbic system in that frontal part of your brain behind the sinus cavity. But even just the 633 LED, which doesn't even have the oomph of the 655 laser component, I have seen some people have some interesting autonomic responses to even that. So if we're talking about circulation, potentially even regulatory heart rate and thermoregulation, I have seen some people really respond to even just that little yellow red laser at 633. So all of these together are honestly kind of an ideal package. But the reason you're going to hear me talk a little bit more about the 810s, so you can buy any of those in any combination and dual wield, like double barrel, any of them. I have been the last handful of months taking the two 810s and pulsing them both at 10 hertz or pulsing them both at 40 and really kind of looking at what can I do with just the intranasal and nothing else. And so I've got some data today I'm going to show you, pre-post EEG data about when I hooked someone up full 19-channel EEG and then just did intranasal options. But when you were thinking, what is something that's affordable, introductory, and effective that I could send home with people to use in between sessions? This is honestly where I start most people out. This is something that you guys can do when they're in session. Remember, I promised concurrent. It doesn't matter how you hook them up with any EEG device. You can plug in the nose stuff. What you can consider is whether you choose the 10 hertz or whether you choose the 40 hertz. As you are thinking through what type of neurofeedback protocols you might select, you've got the two variables. One is, am I pulsing at 10 or am I pulsing at 40? The other one is all that lower limbic recruitment potentially that's happening that you could also be taking advantage of with how you're placing and choosing feedback options with the EEG. Let's say we shift over to transcranial. So there's intranasal, that's up the nose, and then there's transcranial. When you guys are out here Googling for literature and publications and you're trying to read what kind of research is actually behind a lot of these options, photobiomodulation obviously is an emerging term that you should see on PubMed pretty consistently. So you can Google photobiomodulation, transcranial photobiomodulation, and then intranasal photobiomodulation. All of those are probably good key terms for y'all to just scroll through. What is the difference between transcranial and intranasal so far as impact? There's a couple articles in there about the difference between, so some, based on some Monte Carlo modeling and potentially some other stuff, the differences between trying to do transcranial LED and intranasal based on skin tone and skin shade. As you guys know, the higher amounts of melanin in your skin, the darker your skin tone, the less light that potentially absorbs through and the more that might get absorbed and potentially refracted. One of the things that has emerged from recent literature is you do not see the same amount of slightly less permeation with darker skin shades when you use the intranasal. I wouldn't say it's completely negligible when you're doing transcranial, but there is an amount of difference when you're using transcranial as opposed to intranasal. You'll get just a little bit less penetration with darker skin tones. So that is a thing to consider. How do you fix it? It's an emerging conversation. Do we just let it sit on them a little bit longer? Do we do it a little bit more frequently? Still a conversation that's developing. But that is another consideration as well. If you've got somebody with significantly darker skin tones and you are potentially only doing transcranial and you're maybe not getting the results you're seeing with other people, another argument for considering the intranasal as well. This medial device, we have LEDs across the sensory motor, front and back, sort of a FZ-PZ, almost like a C3, C4 situation. There's one at the base of the skull, and then there's an LED in the intranasal. So you have, 6 total? These are also 810 LEDs, 810 nanometer, 810 wavelength LEDs, and they pulse at 10 or 40 hertz. Now, this is the medium range because you can here are 3 things I really like about this as an option. One is there's a little bit of space for you to put independent electrodes. You can put EEG electrodes and do concurrent, like simultaneous neurofeedback with this as well. I have seen a couple people use softer caps, even with a few dry electrode placements. I think you're probably gonna get your best results if you actually go straight free lead EEG right onto the scalp. If you wanna work around this guide, that's my recommendation. But you see there is a certain amount of scalp that is free, so you can 100% do some concurrent. Now, question emerging is, well, if I am doing EEG, if I'm doing neurofeedback at the same time that I'm doing something like this, what happens if I potentially change it from 10 to 40 hertz and that little DC kick jumps? And also, to what degree is there going to be LED interference with the power supply into my EEG itself? One of the absolutely understandable concerns when doing any type of neurostimulation or neuromodulation with either a pulsed electromagnetic field coil, an LED, electrical cranial, the question is always, how can I do this at the same time I'm doing EEG? Either for collecting data, just watching what it's doing in real time, or also for the clarity or purity or accuracy of the EEG signal that you're basing neurofeedback on. There are absolutely some puritanical components of our industry who believe you cannot do any type of STIM at the same time you're trying to do any EEG recording or neurofeedback. I absolutely understand where they're coming from. I'm over a little bit more in the guerrilla warfare trenches of trying anything that might work. And so some years ago, I was trying to figure out if it was viable to run pulse EMF coils simultaneously in real time with neurofeedback. Here is what I will tell you. The signals definitely can get messy. There are a couple ways to mitigate it. What compelled me was that it worked. What compelled me is that results happened. So what I've been doing is trying stuff out, trying to gather data, and then trying to reverse engineer from things that clinically seem to be impactful back to why does this work? How is it replicable as much as possible, right, across a wider application? Why does it not seem to matter as much that the signal's messy? So I have one working hypothesis, which is that we are walking around in an electromagnetic soup all of the time. It's not like our brain gets really clear, unmixed signals about everything that's happening in the electrical field around us. So I think there's a certain amount of discriminatory capability that our brains have that we may be underestimating, which I think could be part of this. The other thing to consider as well is that when you are combining neurofeedback, most of the time there is an auditory or a visual component to the feedback element. It is true that auditory or visual component is reliant on the continuous EEG signal. So when you're introducing like a little EMF or a little LED, into that signal and making it slightly more complex or messy, that is a relevant component. But the brain really does seem to be able to sort things out. So I think the hesitation most of us have with combining things is the fact that there's only so many data bits we can keep simultaneously in working memory. And the more complex things that we're trying to think about or pay attention to, most of us are tapping out between 3 and 5 data bits simultaneously. And however many things you can think about at the same time is however complex or nuanced of a concept or layers of a concept that you can hold. And so if we're tapping out at a few, and most people are going to tap out very quickly 2 or 3 data bits simultaneously at most. And this is where we get a lot of that black and white binary thinking that people emerge with. I'm going to talk a little bit later about what I think we can do to help support more complex processing speed and maybe even widen that bandwidth a bit for people, which I honestly think is the most supportive thing that we can do for the human race these days, is help to widen out some of that bandwidth to reduce the amount of stress we all feel with the overwhelm of just trying to exist day to day, but also to create a little bit more breathing space for people who want to be able to show up, make good decisions, take in information, and try to just think through what they're doing and why. So everything we're doing with photobiomodulation, with light and neurofeedback, is this idea of, can we help people's brains increase a little bit of bandwidth so it doesn't seem as overwhelming interacting with everything, increase that bandwidth, and then create more capability to consider information and then respond to it with more accuracy and maybe more efficacy. So I'm talking in generalities, but I feel like you guys can apply this quite easily to a lot of things you're all thinking about right now. When we say things like, okay, we've got this little neuro duo, and we can stick a couple of EEG electrodes around it and think through doing unconnected at this moment, but simultaneous neurofeedback, what would be the potential advantages? Have you guys heard the phrase or the term synaptogenesis? It's a fancy term, genesis meaning creation, synapses obviously. It's a fancy term that essentially means the creation of new synapses or synaptic activity. One of the reasons I originally was even interested in photobiomodulation was the capability that was being indicated in the literature even 10 years ago, was the synaptogenetic potential of creating so much sort of cellular level, mitochondrial level activity that then potentially allowed for, more cellular energy and activation that allowed for more possible network connectivity behaviors. I think that neurofeedback is possibly an unparalleled intervention to support network connectivity, either repair or even building in the first place. Because there's rehabilitation and then there's habilitation. And so the idea of being able to create network impacts, network effects, to be able to build new communication lines between different areas of your brain, I genuinely think, because what else does that? Obviously physical movement, sort of the bilateral physical movement creates a certain amount of integration and network building. I'm trying to think what actively really creates, the different things that we try to do to learn, us interacting with our environment visually, auditorily, physically, like these are things that we do to learn. Like you learn a sport, you learn to dance, you learn to play whatever. A lot of the connections that we're making is just regular inputs in patterns, and then our brains are essentially saying, okay, I have identified a regular demand on my energetic production. It's taking me a lot more energy than it really should to swing a tennis racket back and forth. I need to figure out whatever the neuronal requirements are of tennis racket swinging, and then I need to routinize whatever that is and make it way more energy efficient because I cannot be this worn out from swinging a racket Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so anything that's new that your brain learns, there is that initial increase in energetic output, and then your brain says, okay, that's a lot of energy, let's make this more efficient. It will routinize and create those pathways and create those network infrastructures. So anything you're doing in the brain that learns anything is network dependent to a degree. So our capacity to have the resources and energy, like at a physiological level, available for that cortical infrastructure building, a lot of that obviously is dietary. The raw building blocks really do come in based on what you're eating and drinking. Some of that is light exposure dependent. How efficiently is your body able to convert based on what you're giving it supplement-wise and light-wise? How efficiently is it able to convert those raw materials into the energy chains that we then use to build and operate? So, I'm not going to talk about all the really obvious other things like nutrition and stuff that we could be, exercise that we could be doing. Photobiomodulation has the potential capacity to help support and even jumpstart some of those energy conversion and development chains. So when we were thinking about, okay, I've got somebody who comes in to work with me and their systems are so compromised, they're so energetically fatigued. Sometimes when people don't have resources to respond to things, and they come and we do 3 sessions, 5 sessions, 8 sessions, everyone's getting a little anxious because we're not really seeing the results. It's a natural thing for us to want to ramp up. Let's do more, let's add more, let's make it longer. I don't think that is an unreasonable impulse. What you could consider is that a gas tank running on empty doesn't necessarily have more to give just because you floor the gas pedal. Sometimes when you guys are thinking like, here's an intro level that I think I want to start somebody out, maybe I'll do a 2-channel or 4-channel neurofeedback protocol. Like I've got a couple of favorites, like something in the 4 to 6 channel range that I'll kind of start people off with in the first couple sessions. And then what photobiomodulation, like this is a good middle of the road option. What are the things I want to introduce them in the first couple sessions? Some people will be quite sensitive and responsive, and in the first few sessions they will say, I feel things. They notice their own vasodilation. I feel stuff. I'm noticing things. Some people will have a lot of kind of quick response. Other people will notice nothing. So let's say you do 3-4 sessions and they keep coming in and saying nothing. Okay, 2 things. Thing number 1, people are notoriously unreliable narrators of their own experience. So just because they're telling you they don't notice anything doesn't mean nothing is happening. But it is good for you to have already a framework of contextualization for helping them identify what were the couple of things they really wanted to prioritize paying attention to. And every time they come in, you are asking them the same exact questions. Whether you want to give them a little Likert scale to rate those couple of identified priorities on, whether you just want to ask them. But it takes people somewhere between maybe 5 and 8 repetitive visits and sessions and asks for you to train them to be better observers of themselves over time. So those first 10 sessions that you're doing with anybody is essentially second assessment. And it's really not a bad idea for you to think about it that way yourself, and also even to potentially tell people these first 10, maybe even 15 sessions, we are really trying to understand how responsive or resistant, how energy available or energy compromised. And I'm using energy like actual physical resources. Listen, I love a good aura vibe as much as anyone else, but when you guys hear me say energy today, I mean actual physical energy production. When you guys are talking with people about the photobiomodulation neurofeedback options independently or combined, helping them to understand that sometimes we do not see the level of immediate response in those first 5 or 6 sessions or 10, because if you have a sufficiently compromised system, if you've been ill a few times, if you've got a fairly significant injury, if your system is having trouble converting and producing the energetic resources needed to create the cortical activity that then results in learning and infrastructure building, me just piling more demand on you doesn't necessarily help. Because what do people do when you ask them to do too many things at the same time? They tend to shut down. Or, they shut down or they react very strongly. They lash out or they shut down, right? Meltdown, shut down. So if you have people coming in and you're not seeing, if you ramp up 1 or 2 sessions and you're still not really seeing, consider actually ramping down. Maybe let's do 2-channel EEG. Maybe let's do just intranasal. Because that's the fun thing about this, right, is you don't have to put that thing on their head. You can just plug that one little intranasal into their nose. 5 minutes on one side, 5 minutes on the other, or 10, or whatever you want to do. You can literally just do that. Scaling back is an option as well. And the reason I spend so much time talking about this is because I have had, and I'm sure you guys have seen it too, I've had a number of evolutions over my neurofeedback arc career where new fancy stuff came out. I was very excited, early adopter, started doing it. More EEG. The first time I got to do 19-channel EEG training, I might have lost my mind for like 2 months. Everybody was just getting hooked, you know what I mean? Like half my kids with autism were like, seriously? Like, why is the cap happening? You promised it was only like every 3 months and now. And so I was really kind of leaning into the more is better, which I think is something we are all a little prone to. We do live in a consumerist economy where we're looking for good value for our output. I had some people I was working with where I was really not seeing that movement on the more STIM, more EEG end. And so what happened was one day something went down, I don't remember what it was, and I had to run like a 4-channel EEG neurofeedback on a number of people that had been on the 19 channel with extra STIM. I think out of like 8 people that day, I think I had 6 come back and tell me, I really noticed something that I hadn't noticed with like the heavier duty. And so obviously that introduced the idea that when you were not seeing the movement, maybe, because remember, brains are people. If you are giving the brain too much and it either doesn't have the energy capability to use it, or it doesn't have the processing speed and cortical infrastructure to learn the complex thing you're giving it, scaling down, let's just start with shapes and colors. There's a certain amount of relaxation that happens with something not being overwhelming, and then building up over a handful of sessions is something a little bit more demanding. I genuinely can't emphasize that enough, because later I'm going to say so many fancy, complicated things about options. I don't think that they're better. I think that they're different and useful in their own ways. The Neuro Pro 2, the one that I said might be the most cutting edge one we have currently, the Neuro Pro 2 actually has 10 transcranial LEDs. So there's a lot of coverage. You put this thing on your head, there's not much room for other stuff. This is not the one that I would identify as immediately the most compatible with doing more dense EEG arrays. You can get a couple in there if you do individual lead EEGs, but this is not the one I would automatically pair doing a concurrent neurofeedback session. Now, part of the reason this is such an LED dense design is because if we consider the complete customizability, every LED can be programmed independently or combined in any number of combinations with the other LEDs to do completely unique stuff. That means you can pick any of them that you want, including the 2 intranasals, and then you can also pulse at any frequency you want. So these are also currently 810 nanometer. Because the 3 devices I'm talking about today have an 810 nanometer wavelength, part of what I wanted to do was toss in a couple slides for you guys to have as well, referencing why potentially people might make decisions to go with the 810 LED in their devices. One of the things that definitely jumped out at me, and I stole this off your off your website, was the idea of, remember I was talking about absorbability? So when we're trying to penetrate through the skull, through water, we're trying to think through like how are we getting to the brain. There's a certain amount of like water volume and metabolic considerations. The near infrared window is defined by the absorption of photons by blood at the shorter wavelengths and by water at the longer wavelengths. You guys will notice there's a little crossover here, and see this right here? We're a little bit after 800. I think part of the reason so many people have leaned into the sort of 800 to 820 range, because I think there's some stuff with like 830 and 808 and I think people have leaned into this range because there is almost like a sweet spot for maximum penetration through absorbability of photons, right? When we are thinking through, I can do just photobiomodulation, I can do just neurofeedback, and then I can combine them. If you're only gonna do photobiomodulation, like if this is the only device you have, if you do not have neurofeedback, to me it also makes sense to have a fancier photobiomodulation with more customizability options. And this is part of why the Neuro Pro as well was so exciting for me when it came out. I'm gonna show you a little bit of data with that original Neuro Pro that came out a year or 2 ago, and then I'm gonna show you what we're doing with the Neuro Pro 2. There is so much in the literature on the idea of creating actual energetic production or helping that energy conversion chain at the cellular level with light. Honestly, even just the brain-derived neurotropic factor research is really compelling. And the other thing that I think is emerging for all of us, I know because I'm short, I look a little young, but I have hit my mid-40s, and I think most of us in here are starting to think about that second half, the long slide, long if we're lucky, I guess. How are we sustaining and maintaining cognitive function, especially in the face of injury and illness, which is becoming more and more prominent, and under the umbrella of a possibly collapsing healthcare system, where not all of the resources that we would like to have available for health, preventative or reparative, is really on the table. So people like us are filling in a very specific Wild West gap in healthcare almost, where we are trying to not overpromise and underdeliver. We're trying not to make claims that aren't real or don't make sense or aren't backed up by data, but we are seeing such promising preliminary findings that neurofeedback and photobiomodulation, some of these more sort of fringy neuromodulation options, have clear impact. Again, we're not trying to necessarily overclaim, but there is compelling, robust research saying that there are cellular level support and changes from using photobiomodulation. So when you guys are just thinking through how to even support people coming in with significant post-viral long-term effects and or aging, because I don't have all of this in here, but there also is a pretty direct link emerging right now in literature between viruses, viral infections, even stuff you got as a kid, and the onset of neurodegenerative disease and conditions. You might have got Bartonella, cat scratch disease when you were 8, and it's just sitting there in your lymph system, and then you get, I don't know, who doesn't have one or two of the 17 herpes simplex viruses out there? And then, you get like a nice round of COVID or two, and then you get, at some point it accumulates, and there's a certain amount of allostatic load, a certain amount of strain on your system. How are we supposed to mitigate that? Where are the answers? This is a possible tool in the toolbox for us to consider. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on these, but I've got them in here for y'all to consider when you might make choices in that Neuro Pro 2 with the 12 customizable LEDs. When you guys are thinking through how to potentially make choices, when we consider bottom of the brain, the subcortical to cortical regions that we have to consider. When we think sort of that EEG neurofeedback, we're very much, a lot of us are kind of hanging out in that 10-20 vocabulary. We're like, oh, I did an FZ protocol. I did like a C3, C4. I did like a, like a parietal. We think in terms of almost like that surface geography. If we also start to think about it more three-dimensionally, because I'm going to talk some about Eslaretta, source localization, current source density stuff later. If you start to think a little bit more dimensionally, you have some network considerations. So bear with me. We've got top-down, interhemispheric, intrahemispheric, front-back, but you've also got some of those fun diagonal potential networks to consider. For example, if all the LEDs are programmable, one of the features that the Neuro Pro 2 has, if you can link a left intranasal LED to some right placement LEDs, especially ones that are like along, almost like that right temporal, right sensory motor, and you can link the right intranasal LED over here, left, there are some strong anterior cingulate to insula, to parahippocampal, to temporal networks that really underlie not only just emotional recruitment and regulation, but also core attention and memory elements as well. Because there's no way to separate out memory from emotion. And what makes us incredibly nostalgic? Smells. So when you layer in smell, memory, and emotion, that underlying kind of subcortical limbic structures, you can create some very specific contralateral effects as well, right along the bottom of the brain. And remember, I promised up, down, side, side, front, back. Well, you've got diagonal, side, side, which you can also do like right parietal to like bottom of the inferior frontal. there's genuinely no limitation to how you can think about connecting up stuff other than your own imagination and your comfort with like thinking in spatial geography. Now, if any of you played Tetris, if any of you played 3D Tetris, if any of you have ever packed a moving van, you probably have a decent estimate of your own comfort with like that 3-dimensional, almost 4-dimensional space visualization. But I would encourage, if you can, just holding those ideas, because we've kind of gone, I wouldn't say it's really flat, but when we approach neurofeedback protocols, we tend to be sort of surface. We almost flatten it out. You take the globe and you make it flat, and there's a little bit of distortion in what the countries actually look like. We're doing somewhat the same thing with the brain, where we're just thinking maybe surface, sensor site, EEG, neurofeedback protocol selection. So I've got fun things in here for you guys to have, and they are mainly just thinking through that bottom up, top down network capability. For example, when I was looking at these, I was reading through, I'm like, what? I literally said, what even is a mediodorsal nucleus? This was actually prior to me even thinking through all this olfactory bulb. I was like, what even is this? I probably made this slide 1.5 years ago. Look at this. It relays inputs from the amygdala and olfactory cortex and projects to the prefrontal cortex and limbic system, and then relays them to the prefrontal association cortex, playing a crucial role in pretty much everything anybody comes in for treatment for. Attention, planning, organization, multitasking, active memory. So when I'm giving you guys these visuals, these are the things that I'm using to try to help me think through how I would make choices. All right, fancy LED stuff. Location, where is the LED physically on the head? Frequency, what frequencies am I choosing to have it pulse at? This is the Neuro Pro 2 layout. So these are the LEDs with the left and the right intranasal option. These are the LEDs. This is a very primitive stab that I have made for people kind of at an introductory level to think about how to associate maybe brain geography with the placement of those LEDs. So when you were thinking, what do I want to select to affect which things? Again, extremely rudimentary. I accept all objections to any of the choices here because I'm sure they're valid. But when you're going to start people off somewhere, the idea is, what am I actually trying to affect? So when you guys are doing neurofeedback and you're picking out your handful, when you do neurofeedback, are you hanging out kind of more in the 1 to 2 channel selections? Are you guys doing more sort of a 4 to 6? Are you doing a 19? Okay, 2 channel. It looks like we've got a good array here. Even when we're doing all the way up to 19 channel selections, there were some advantages to having a nice full spectral impact on the brain. The advantage to more is you have more context. The advantage to less is you have more specificity. It's our job to figure out how to add in enough context that we're giving the brain data so it can make more complex and informed decisions, because remember, brains are people. You give people only very little amounts of data. It's going to take what you've given them and it's going to try to contextualize that in what it already knows. An excellent learning arc that I think we've all experienced is teach people sort of simple stuff first and then add in nuance and complexity and layer that in over time. But even if you go straight in for a whole lot of context, we're absolutely going to rely on the brain to still sort that out and do something useful with it. If you are not compromised, and by that I mean significant brain injury or significant maybe post-viral illness, like production of fatigue, if you are not significantly compromised, most brains innately take whatever you give it and try to pull something useful out of that and learn from it. But a lot of full head feedback. You have to think about however many LEDs or however many EEG electrodes. You have to think about that in terms of how much demand, how much energetic demand are you making on that central nervous system? Because the more you're asking them to pay attention to, the more demand, and the quicker the threshold for the shutdown before it's harder to learn. When you guys are considering someone who comes in and you're asking them questions about how they're doing and what their priorities are, if they're already telling you, I'm low energy, I've got a lot of fatigue, I have a lot of brain fog, I'm really having trouble, start them off couple of electrodes, a handful of LEDs, maybe starting off the LEDs more towards the bottom, the intranasals, the placements like a little bit lower, that cerebellum one. Starting them off there is often a good beginning. However, remember, you are asking them to identify what their priorities are. For people who are actually interested in the Neuro Pro 2, I've also made a handful of what I would consider to be starter protocols that are pulled from the range of possible ways that you guys could think about using it, and also pulled from the array of EEG data that we're all accessing, and they're made for the purpose of you guys having something to help stimulate your own imagination for what you could potentially do. Because when we are considering why do we pick which EEG ranges, what we're doing, if we're going to simplify it down, we've got slower waves and faster waves. Faster waves are more engagement in complex processing and more externally oriented tasking. Slower waves are more internally oriented, a little bit more physiological, a little bit more brain-body, right, supportive. And then we've got that sort of alpha range in the middle of fast and slow. Part of the reason we really lean into alpha training, either peak alpha frequency training, alpha synchrony training, just make more alpha training. Part of the reason we really lean into that, and SMR, that 12 to 15 hertz right across the sensory motor strip, those are alpha and SMR are classic neurofeedback starter options, because think about what they are. If your capacity to speed up into the faster waves and engage, and slow down into the slower waves and relax or work on more internally oriented physiological repair, if your capacity to appropriately respond to environmental demand and then relax when there's not things demanding, and then engage when things are happening, and then relax and work on stuff, a healthy flexible brain does that. Almost everybody you're working with, probably some of us as well, we don't have those really nice state flexible brains. We usually end up kind of camping in one side of the spectrum or the other. So we make a lot of persistent fast wave, and we're very engaged in ways that may be great for possibly even peak performance and vigilance, may be less great for long-term sustainability. So there's a lot of us that burn, and then crash. And then there are people who hang out more in the slow wave range. They have more, and you see this often in people who are maybe not too far out from a traumatic brain injury, and people who have just a lot of post-viral impact. We see more slow waves, because slow waves, deltas and thetas, are really what we generate when we are trying to repair things. So when you think about like putting somebody into a coma immediately post a pretty severe brain injury, we put them into a medical coma, and when you're in a coma, what are you primarily making? Delta? A little theta? Like a lot of slow wave, right? Because it's delta and theta in which we do the majority of our repair work. We physically source and repair things at the cellular level. Even if you've had just a regular old knock on the head, it's not uncommon to see, sometimes even a decade later, a little bit of slowing, a little too much delta or theta, even up in your cortex, post-brain injury, that never just got sped up and reintegrated back into the wider network. Part of what we're looking at is, it's not whole brain. There's always these little persistent pockets or regions. It's rare to have someone whose whole brain is just beta. That is a thing that it can look like you do some brain maps and you do some evaluations, and there is so much dominant beta behavior, geographically across the whole assessment, that you're like, this is just like a brain full of beta. Now, obviously, if they're walking around and talking and feeding themselves, clearly they're making all the frequencies all the time. But there is a predominance of certain tasking state. So you can see kind of global slowing and or global fast wave, but usually if there's global slowing, you've got some pretty significant functional issues. And if there's a global fast frequency, it's not a bad idea to pay attention to and do some inquiry into systemic inflammatory markers and considerations. This is not medically diagnostic whatsoever. Over the last 20 years, I have seen fairly consistent correlations with independently diagnosed systemic inflammatory issues with a lot of full spectral excess, like hyperexcitability. So if you've got like a global red brain, it's not a bad idea to ask additional questions about inflammation. And I'm just going to leave that as like a general category of inquiry. So when we're thinking in terms of a healthy functional brain is state flexible, it's not like your whole brain like speeds up into gamma or slows down into theta. There are levels and pockets of behavior that we're essentially looking for. We expect more slow wave predominantly. This is very rudimentary. Delta-ish, more along the brainstem cerebellum is we make all the brain waves everywhere, but that's kind of lower brainstem cerebellum. We see a predominance of slow waves, delta. We see a lot of theta in the limbic structures, the subcortical regions. And then when you get to that thalamocortical oscillation, hypothalamus, the thalamic nuclei do that nice little gating, that oscillatory gating mechanism. So when you're trying to recruit physical resources from all the body-oriented repair, slow wave physiological stuff, we're trying to recruit that up into the cortex from the bottom of the brain. The thalamocortical oscillation is gate and then relax, recruit stuff up. Gate, because you can't always be in recruitment mode. You have to gate so that you can be in production, do something tasking mode. So that thalamocortical oscillation is literally that oscillatory, let those carrier waves, like theta is a strong carrier wave for a lot of these physiological resources we're talking about, how you're going to feed the upper brain. Because if it starts down here, it's got to get carried up the central nervous system and then get to the brainstem, to the bottom of the brain, up into the cord. Like, how does that happen? Like, obviously there was highways for that. The thalamocortical oscillation is really that nice gating mechanism that relaxes, recruits stuff up, gates so that we can do other things, relaxes. If at the theta to alpha level, so by the time, so we're thinking like delta, theta, alpha. So the thalamic nuclei are strong alpha generators. All right, now we're like betas and gammas. Again, rudimentary. Here's why I'm talking about this. When we do that nice thalamocortical oscillation and then we recruit stuff up, we're expecting a certain amount of slow wave to be present across the cortex. You want to give everybody lunch at the same time. You want to give everybody information. You put them on the same radio channel. That's the most efficient way to disperse. So we expect a certain amount of delta and theta to be present cortically, especially under certain conditions. What we don't love is when there is persistent slow wave hanging out in locations and we are not seeing it speed up or slow down. Because what happens is we recruit stuff up, theta carries it up there, Delta's an excellent carrier for neurotransmitters. You gotta have a certain amount of inferior frontal delta so you can recruit neurotransmitters and propagate them back across the cord. We expect a certain amount of delta and theta. They do jobs that are critical. What we don't love is having non-transient, persistent slow wave. So part of what we look for when we're thinking about brain maps, and especially like in the frontal cortex, one of the most traditional classic protocols is the theta-beta ratio. Why does the theta-beta ratio work? Well, if you've got a lot of persistent theta in your frontal cortex in that FZ-ish range, right? Like why in the 70s and 80s was this a thing? Let's say it's 82 and we've got one electrode to work with. How are we going to get the most out of it? Part of the reason that theta-beta ratio training worked is we were like, you're just spending too much time in theta up here in the frontal cortex. Just spend more time in beta and you get some happy dings when you just spend more time in beta, basic learning. And so it was as effective as it was because we were genuinely saying, like, listen, there's too much theta here, not too much theta power, but you are spending too much time in the theta tasking range. Because remember, these are different tasking states. This little summary here, the reason I'm camping on this is because if we think about this as tasking states, not like you're making too much beta. You are spending too much time, or you're spending more time than we would want in those beta tasking states. That means you're doing all the beta stuff, but that's less appropriate time you have doing all the other stuff, which is just as relevant. So when you guys are even thinking through neurofeedback, it's not like you're trying to increase or decrease. And this is the language we use because these are the measurements. We're measuring microvoltage or voltage, essentially. We're like, we stick an electrode. We measure everything that's happening right here. And then we bin it out into like frequency bands. And then we go, oh, you have like a a dominant rhythm, right? You have a peak of activity. And visually, the way we display it is power, how much, like big and little. We're displaying it like that, but what that represents, right? Because you did like minutes, at least 3 or 5 minutes of recording to get that little display. And you did at least 256 samples per second if you're going to do baseline Nyquist analysis. So you've got, in a handful of minutes, if you've got a minimum of 256 samples a second, you have thousands and thousands of samples. What's the brain doing now? What's it doing now? What's it doing now? What's it doing now? You have thousands of samples to average over to say, every time I checked in to see what it was doing, it was hanging out in beta. So now we've got this like display where we're like, oh, you have a peak, you have like a dominant thing. Oh, look how much beta you're making. That's too much beta. Let's make less beta. I encourage you guys to think about it less as making less power or making more power, and more as spending more time in the frequency range that represents a tasking state. It's reasonable for us to talk about it in that power language because we're measuring and displaying it like that. How are you supposed to know how much time the brain spends in a tasking state? We're literally saying, we're measuring, right? And then we're looking at that whole spectrum, delta to gamma, and going, where's the most power? But the power represents more times that it was there over the course of the measurements. So that's literally time you spend in the tasking state. So when we are picking neurofeedback, we're often thinking in terms of make stuff go down and make stuff go up. And listen, it's not that that's wrong, it's just that it's limited. Remember, simultaneous data bits in working memory? If you can add in the dimension of more time spent in a tasking state, why would we encourage them to make more alpha? Well, if you're pegged out in high beta or you're pegged out in low theta and you do not have a healthy alpha peak, why do we care about that alpha peak? We care because if you are not spending enough time hanging out in alpha, a healthy dominant rhythm for an adult is like what, somewhere between 9 and 11 hertz? Why? Because the more time you spend hanging out in alpha, the quicker you can get up into fast and the quicker you can get down into slow. It's literally the optimal flexibility range to hang out in. So if you have a peak, a healthy peak in an alpha range, if your peak isn't spending all the time in beta, all the time in theta, if you have a healthy peak, it means you actually hang out in alpha, so you can speed up or slow down based on environmental cueing. That is a state flexibility indicator. So when we say things like, oh, why would I pick 10 hertz? Like, why would I pulse at 10 hertz, either intranasal or the whole head? Why would I pick 10 hertz as an option? Why would I encourage a certain amount of frequency resonance or frequency following response from the brain to 10 hertz? Well, that's right in the middle of that sort of healthy alpha range. How am I delivering the 10 hertz? So for example, like locationally, where would I be sticking stuff in? Like, what's the delivery mechanism for the pulsing?
Just like the neuro duo with the intranasal.
I have wondered if the difference, so the idea of like frequency resonance or frequency following, as you begin to comb through the literature, look through all the different ways people are trying to figure out what different frequencies do to the brain and see what their response sets are. One of the things that's going to emerge is that there is no consistent response sets for anything. That doesn't mean that there aren't principles that we can derive and use, but what that means is you put 10 hertz, like any type of 10 hertz delivery, pulse EMF, photobiomodulation, anything, you introduce 10 hertz, the same exact delivery into like 30 people, and you may potentially have 30 different response sets. Why? Now, this is a really fun conversation that Lou and I have been having for 5 or more years now, because if you've got 2 choices at 10 hertz or 40, and people are like, well, what does the 10 hertz do? What does the 40 hertz do? And we really think that the 10 hertz helps to increase state flexibility and integration. I'll talk more about this. We think the 40 hertz really might help with more processing speed and network support and complexity. and engagement. We have these principles, and the principles are sound. But here's what's absolutely fascinating. You take somebody and you give them 10 hertz. Some people slow down and relax. They've got a pegged out brain, and you put 10 hertz on them and you just see them, like I've seen people physically melt into furniture from just a little intranasal 10 hertz. I have seen other people that I have put 10 hertz on because they have very fast brains. And they're like, I'm not really noticing anything. I put the 40 on them and they calm down. Why? Okay, two things. How does stimulants work for kids with attention deficit disorder? We take hyperactive children and we give them basically legal cocaine, legal crack, legal methamphetamines. We give kids meth and then they calm down. Why are we giving hyperactive kids stimulants and then they calm down? Why does that work? Okay, think about the dual inhibitory demand. The dual inhibitory demand is if I am going to focus on something, I'm going to read a book. I do not activate a line of book-shaped neurons to read the book. What do I have to do to focus on one thing? I have to inhibit all the potential things the impulsive things that could be coming out of me that I could be doing other than focus on that book. I have to inhibit all the impulses coming out of me. And I also have to differentiate from or inhibit or ignore all the incoming external inputs that could be distracting me. So the amount of actual energy resources I need for complex inhibition is pretty high. That dual complex inhibition is quite high. Now remember earlier I was like, oh, slow waves, delta, theta, then we get up into the alpha, and now we're recruiting up into the core. Okay, remember I said if you put everybody on theta, it's much easier to get those resources across, but we don't want the whole brain hanging out in theta, because what happens if you have big theta waves? Seizures, all sorts of other problems, right? What we want is once we get the utilitarian elements of that resourcing up and available, we then want, instead of like big slow waves everywhere, we want independent local pockets of fast wave activity. So what happens is beta is where we really see that differentiation or independent come in. We pull things up into the cortex and then we speed stuff up and we create these independent beta pockets. So all those local regions in the brain, this is why I was like, where are we putting the 10 hertz? All those little local regions in the brain do independent localized function. This is why we have like Brodmann areas and all these like attempts to figure out which part of the brain does which thing. Obviously we know it's a lot of them linked together that do more complex tasking, but there are some focal local areas that are responsible for certain things that we then, network in to do other stuff. So now we've got all these independent beta pockets. Gamma comes in and helps to network together all those independent beta regions to do the more complex tasking. We've got a very reliable behavior set for these different frequency tasks. If I give a kid a stimulant, a fast frequency stimulant, because you usually see a lot of fast frequency behavior when you give kids or people human stimulants. The other flip side of that, which is what really kind of nails home why it works the way it does, what happens when you give somebody a benzodiazepine? What happens if you give them Xanax or Valium or whatever? What physically happens in the brain, in the EEG? You see this really interesting, almost 20 to 30 hertz, very observable 20 to 30 hertz wall that occurs. We're giving human stimulants so that they can be less hyperactive, and we're giving people benzodiazepines so that they can be more relaxed. Okay, the mechanisms of how this works at a chemical level, I'm not even going to touch. It's very interesting. How this pans out in the EEG and then for us functionally, like so. I'm having trouble because I'm impulsive. Fast frequency beta is not just, so when we say inhibitory, inhibition is not just stop, inhibition is differentiation and focus. So when I say dual inhibition and I say things like, oh, now we're speeding up into the beta ranges, and beta is where we do the complex, independent, differentiated behaviors. For you to be able to separate out your brain and do independent behaviors that then gamma can come along and link together, that's a beta behavior, which means all the complex inhibition is almost always happening in the beta ranges, especially higher end betas, maybe that 20 to 30 hertz. So that means that you're going to see more complex inhibition when you put somebody on a stimulant, but it means you put them on Xanax and that 20 to 30 hertz wall appears. Well, now you created that nice little moat, because anybody who's been on a benzo will tell you it's not like my problems went away, I just didn't care as much. But what happened was my reaction was muted. So if you think about a 20 to 30 hertz wall, essentially it's a wall, like the you're not reacting to it. So now what we have are clear metabolic and chemical indicators that line up with beta being that kind of dual inhibition. The question was, what if you already make a lot of nice 10 hertz alpha and we're gonna stick 10 hertz on you?
More faster, like if your peak is faster.
If your peak is faster, let's say your peak is like a 12 or like an 11 and a half. Like,
Gifted kid.
Sure, gifted kid. Okay, this is highly relatable. I mean, for all of us. But I'm joking a little bit because 20 years ago, my dominant peak was 14 and a half, which I consider to be a little pathological. And it gave me hypervigilance and anxiety problems as well as being high performing. Nowadays, it's more in the 12 to 12 and a half. You probably notice I'm a little less high strung than I would have been if you'd met me 15 years ago. When you already have like maybe a high performance, faster peak, one of the things to consider is context. They're coming in with that higher peak. Is it peak performance or is it stress and anxiety? Usually you can make those determinations by your clinical intake and questions. For some people, it's gonna be a pretty easy, oh, you've got like a 13 and a half peak and you can't sleep and you can't chill out and you're freaking out on your family and you 10 hertz immediately. But let's say we're concerned about potentially slowing down a peak performance element. Okay, so there are 2 or 3 other things that emerge from the principles of complex learning and function. Remember I said earlier that there are so many things happening around us that nobody's getting puritanically clear signals for anything. We love to isolate in neurofeedback land because we can, and because once we make things too complicated, we feel stressed out at a conscious level. Too much for us to keep track of as a provider. But let's say we've got somebody who's peak performance. When I started doing neurofeedback, my main concern was this idea of we're gonna get in there and ask people's brains to function differently. What if I mess something up? What if I break something? What if I reduce a capability that they have? And it is a genuine, reasonable fear when people come in and say, I'm gonna let you muck around in my brain. What if you make me not me? What if you, like, I'm a professional violinist. What if I'm not as good? You know, like, what happens? This was actually at the core of my concerns 20 years ago when I was originally trying to think through how to do neurofeedback training at all. Some of you guys are familiar with the fact that one of my earlier contributions to the field was collaborating with Brainmaster Technologies and creating the original Z-score training designs. In the last 10 to 15 years, the term Z-score training has gotten borrowed and reapplied and recontextualized. So now there are a lot of different kind of applications that are under the Z-score training name, and they don't always do the same thing. I think honestly most of them have a certain amount of appeal, so I'm not really mad at my children cousins of application, but the original intent in the designs I made 20 years ago, and then I've built on since, and we'll probably show you some stuff in the next half of our workshop, the original intent was, how can I be collaborative in training as opposed to dictatorial? Part of that's my personality. I have problems with authority and I don't like being told what to do. And brains are people. Most people don't like being bossed around. And a lot of what we consider to be the side effects maybe of classical neuromodulation or neurofeedback often comes with us saying, you're making too much beta, let's make less of that. And the brain going, I need this to sustain my environmental hypervigilance so that danger things don't happen to me. And so if you ask me to make less beta, then I'm going to somehow be in danger because I can't do the thing. And not only am I going to not make less beta, I'm going to have a nice beta rebound, and then I'm going to have more problems. And so being able to give the brain the combination of context and choice. How can I give it more information instead of like just make less beta? How can I be like, ooh, let's look at the whole spectrum. How much time are you spending? What if you just hung out a little more in alpha than you did? How can I approach like this? Like, can I make software elements that give context and choice as opposed to like commands? So the original Z-score training was the intent of doing that, right? And that's what it has accomplished and what I've built on. Half of the reason was I just don't like being bossed around, so I didn't want to do it to other people. The other half was my concern about asking the brain to do a thing or an adaptive mechanism that independently works for somebody that looks weird on a brain map, right? But works for them. I was worried about training away or affecting a compensatory adaptive mechanism. How am I supposed to know? I don't. I won't. So why am I making that choice? What if I didn't have to? This was the intention, was you come in to see me 3 times a week if you're really enthusiastic and you like me and you have money. You come in fairly regularly. So like, what is that? Tops, let's be real crazy. 3 hours a week of neurofeedback. If you're a professional violinist, how many hours a week do you play your violin? If you work as an air traffic controller, how many hours a week are you doing air traffic controller complex stuff? If you are regularly engaging in a performance behavior, how much regular environmental reinforcement and input do you get every week? Most of us are going to average around 20 to 30 hours, if not more, of regular environmental interaction and input, which means that your little 3 hours a week of neurofeedback, even if you're super effective, is still in the context of that 30 hours of environmental input that should be reinforcing that adaptive mechanism. So right out the gate, I'm going to tell people to worry less maybe about training away or damaging something that is an individual adaptive mechanism. However, that doesn't mean you can't if you have very focalized and specific feedback options. You can absolutely go in there and grab something and then reduce its sensitivity or connectivity to other things. If we couldn't do that, then it wouldn't work in the first place. Part of the reason that I wanted to create feedback options that allowed for choice and collaboration is because what I wanted was to give the brain an option, and this is how it operates, was to give the brain an option like, hey, I've got a handful of sensor sites on the head, and at each site we're tracking the full spectrum of behavior. What are you doing in delta? What are you doing in theta? What are you doing in alpha? We're looking at everything. And then what we're saying is, we have identified some very persistent activities. So you're making a lot, and I'm just using high beta as like a common through line example. You're making a lot of high beta like here in the right parietal. Because remember, my original question to you was, where are we putting the sensor site or the LEDs? So you've got a lot of right beta here at the right parietal. Okay, that could mean like a lot of things. We know the right precuneus is in charge of helping us to differentiate between self and others. In people who are diagnosed in the autism spectrum, we see a lot of right parietal atypicality, and also people with a lot of trauma. We often see a kind of a right parietal predominance of either like a lot of slow or a lot of fast, and it's persistent. Because remember, that's the problem. When you look at a brain map and there is a red spot or a blue spot, there's a tendency to kind of go all spotology with it. But the reason that there's reds and blues is because the Z-scored, quote-unquote, normative referential range is saying we would expect a little bit less time hanging out in theta or beta here. We would expect more of this and less of that. And so what we're identifying for you is a persistence, a lack of flexibility. When you have focal persistence, that means that area is less recruitable and networkable in with your wider complex networks. So one local area that's just doing its own thing is too independent and can't be as easily recruited and organized in with other networks, can take down a whole bunch of network functions, right? So we've got this right parietal that's just like pegged out in high beta. How do we tackle it? Direct or indirect, right? You can go beta down, right? You can do like a nice little inhibit protocol. You can circle the dragon a little bit. You can put a few electrodes around it, and you can enhance or train up like maybe a lower beta range, right? You're not going straight for inhibit. You can encourage you can stick a coil, a pulse EMF coil or an LED right on top of it. Thinking about it focally allows, like the more focal you go, usually the kind of quicker response you give. But that means you're asking that brain, whatever you're asking to do focally there, you're asking that brain to figure out the rest of what the system's gonna do to contextualize that change. So if you can actually give the rest of the brain information. So so you said, okay, somebody's got like a 12 hertz, 11.5 or 12 hertz. You're pretty sure it's peak performance, okay? They seem to be high functioning. Why would we give them 10 hertz? Well, part of the question is, where is that 12 hertz happening? Most of the time, we're looking at that peak alpha sort of in the sensory motor parietal region. We know that the thalamic nuclei produce alpha for that thalamocortical oscillation, and we know that there is almost no reason not to support integration behaviors lower in the brain. So that might be a person where you would absolutely start with maybe the intranasal, maybe a little placement at the cerebellum. You may not place LEDs sensory motor parietal where we're looking for that functional faster frequency. My suspicion is that you're not going to see a detrimental effect. But I say that. I had a couple people, I have put 10 hertz on them, and they have felt a little bit blunted and a little bit disassociative. It's rare. I'm talking like maybe 1 out of 50, maybe less. 1 out of 50 for me, because I got a lot of atypical people I'm trying stuff out on. Most of the times people don't notice much from 10 hertz because they don't notice for themselves the actual foundational changes that we're building on, or they feel a little bit more relaxed. So there's either relaxed or nothing. Occasionally you'll encounter someone who feels a little blunted, and that is likely a person where 10 hertz is not appropriate. But even all the peak performers, faster frequency people that I've worked with, almost all of them have benefited from at 10 hertz as well, because it's that integrative, and it's not even just like the lower range support, it's that alpha synchrony component. There's, where are you hanging out at each location in alpha? Like every location has its own like alpha peak. But if they've all got individual alpha peaks, then how far apart are the peaks? If you've got an 8.5 over here and an 11.2 over here, and like, so the farther away the peaks are, also the harder it is to communicate and synchronize. Alpha synchrony is about about the whole brain being able to connect together and shift. Even though I'm saying there's a lot of independent pockets to consider, the whole brain's capacity for state flexibility is hanging out in the alpha synchrony range. So if you look at everybody's 19 channel display of alpha peak frequency, and you have peaks that are multiple hertz apart, those peaks, those regions are going to have a much harder time synchronizing together to create connectivity and communication behaviors, but also for shifting. So when we're talking about, okay, you have a lot of options, right? This whole fancy Neuro Pro 2, all the things, you've got a lot of options. How are you supposed to figure out what to do? Okay, I'm gonna give y'all a very brief tour through the stuff that I made that comes with it. Protocol cascades are the idea of sequencing multiple things together intentionally to create more complex effects. We do this somewhat naturally with different devices, and even like maybe doing 8 minutes on like a little SMR protocol, and then 5 minutes on like a theta beta, and then 10 minutes on an alpha at the end. Like we're all kind of arranging things in our sessions where we're trying to get, give them the best that we can so far as for the outcome. Couple principles. Principle number 1, the last thing that you do is kind of what you leave them in. So for some people, if you're going to do some strenuous fast frequency work, sometimes 5 or 10 minutes of a alpha photobiomodulation or a little bit of an alpha, neurofeedback at the very end of a session can help integrate and synthesize some things together and help people not leave a little pegged out. People who are like enjoy doing photobiomodulation up into the thousands of hertz, which is honestly quite fun. If you think about the faster the frequency, the more externally oriented the state. I mean, people who are really into meditation and into exploring the universe, yeah, sure, go all the way out into the thousands. It's exciting out in the cosmos, right? But not everybody can always ground back in as easily. So if you're not a super skilled meditator and you kind of go for the expand out and connect with the universe, there is the concept of how would I ground back down. That's not just for meditation, that's for anybody. Because again, what are the 2 reasons most people meditate and or try to manage themselves. They're either saying, I'm too disconnected and I wish to expand out and connect, or they're saying, I am too open and vulnerable. I'd really like to corral in and regulate. For most of us, we probably cycle through both. Sometimes we feel a little isolated and lonely, and sometimes we feel a little overstimulated. But often we have a primary stance where we are pursuing connection and expansion, or we are pursuing, to some degree, like regulation and defense and grounding. In the context of, if you've got people who are trying to expand out, that faster frequency work is what connects them to, helps them navigate in between internal and external environment. For people who are trying to ground down, a lot of that is that connect to your body work. People with a history of trauma often have difficulty with modulating, feeling connected appropriately to their own bodies, and then feeling that they've got reasonable differentiation from other people. A lot of us are a little vulnerable. Let's call us poorly differentiated. We are sensitive to what's happening in our environment, other people's feelings, other people's whatever. It's not just nonsense to say people in your environment can affect you, because we are all generating electrical fields on a biological level. That's information. And not everybody necessarily has the same amount of satellite sensitivity, but some people do not have very well organized differentiation. So people get upset around them, they can't regulate. Other people are so insensitive to your existence that if you hit them in the face with a brick, they might notice that, So the spectrum of like, I'm not paying attention to things and I'm paying attention to things. If we use those principles to consider how we're choosing stuff, right? What am I trying to help this person do? More connected or more sort of like grounded and defended? Do I want to work more in slow frequencies? Do I want to work more in fast frequencies? Do I want to do everything? But what do I leave them on a nice mid-range beta so they feel very connected to their immediate environment? Do I leave them in a nice slow alpha so they feel very connected to their bodies? Do I leave them in some like mid-range beta so they're like, I'm ready to go to work, back to work, after lunch? These are considerations. When I was making these protocols, I was considering the idea that your brain naturally produces cascade behaviors. You have places where you generate, for example, you have filament nuclei alpha generators, and then you have parietal alpha generators. You have cortical generators of alpha. They do kind of slightly different things. Like, they're both alpha. Your brain will naturally shift between different frequency states, different locations. So these 5 protocols that I'm giving you are me doing quite a bit of reading through what does the brain generate, where and why, to create different engagement states. This particular one, Relax and Recover, this is the Neuro Pro 2 12 with the left nasal and the right nasal. This is every single LED for 2 minutes as a beginning starter. The sweep, I don't remember what the sweep is specifically, but I think it might be like 1 to 120 hertz-ish. There's a nice little opening sweep, like quick little, let's just give you some context, let's lay some groundwork. Then you've got 4 minutes of Thalfa, I think that was like my little 6 to 9 range. Notice the LEDs that are lit up, which ones? Just the nasal and just that little cerebellum. 4 minutes of just bottom of the brain, super slow alpha. Now we go to whole brain alpha. 3 minutes. Okay, chiastic. Are you guys familiar with the optical chiasm? The optical chiasm where, yep, exactly. So chiastic just meaning crossover to some degree. This left nasal is connected to the right 3, and this right nasal is connected to the left 3. One of the fun features is that there is an A mode and a B mode. So like A phase and B phase. So that means that you could take a handful of LEDs and make them all do something, and then you could take a different handful of LEDs and make them do something else. And then essentially the way the duty cycle works is like half of the second, the phase A ones are operational, and the other half of the second, the phase B ones are operational. So as you're going through several minutes, you're getting like a very distinct 2 different things at the same time, essentially. So that means that you can sync up anything you want. Now we've got a nice little sort of anterior cingulate, amygdala, inferior temporal, insula. We've got a nice little crossover for bottom of, remember that whole orbital, limbic, remember that all those little pictures I showed you? That's what I'm really trying to target with this. And then the last 5 minutes is just some alpha, again, intranasal and cerebellum. I don't remember how long this is. It's like 22 minutes or 23 minutes or something like this. This is a protocol cascade that follows the natural biological production locations of different frequencies, especially alpha, and says, what would a brain, if I would ask a brain to create alpha, to state shift, to be more relaxed and integrated, what would I be asking it to be doing and where? This is what that is supposed to create. You choose it and you click go and it just does this. Now, part of me putting stuff together like this is just for people not having to figure this out themselves. They can just click it and try it and see if they like it. But the other reason is to help practitioners who are going to want to make their own think through the fact that, like, you can create a sequence, a cascade of anything you want. You're doing it in your sessions already. Come in and do some HRV. Now have a little like neuro field, right? Now have like some alpha stim. Now do a little SMR. We're already doing this. But the intentionality of why would I start with maybe photobiomodulation and then move to neurofeedback? Well, if I'm trying to power up a system, remember power and connectivity? If I'm trying to power up a system so that then it can build the connectivity infrastructure, that seems a natural choice. And I think most people are probably starting off with that and then shifting over. So remember I was talking the idea of grounding. I don't know if you guys are familiar with deep brain reorienting. It's catching a little bit of a wave right now. Frank Corrigan out of the UK, Seaburn Fisher. There's a handful of people who are really kind of into it. And it's this idea that essentially, I'm going to paraphrase very roughly, that your brainstem orients to stuff, obviously, but that your feeling of kind of safety and okayness to some degree is reliant on your capacity to appropriately orient. So it's this idea that, like, your ability to feel connected to your body and your ability to pay attention to what's going on around you, if you cannot integrate being able to pay attention to what's going on around you and what's going on inside of you, you kind of can't ever really feel okay. If you're a little bit too much internally focused or externally focused, you don't feel connected to your body or you don't feel connected to your environment. There's no way to create a sense of predictability and safety that we rely on for even just having baseline central nervous system function. So like this particular one, you will notice that there are 3 little limbic theta. They're slightly slower to slightly faster frequencies. Can't remember if I went 6, 8, 9 or what I did exactly here. But essentially I went slow theta just at the intranasal and cerebellum, bottom of the brain. Hit that little circuit we were talking about. And then I did 11 minutes of a sweep where I went kind of slow alpha all the way up into the mid beta ranges. Now if you break out beta, 12 to 15, 15 to like 20-ish, I don't remember, 20 to 30, whatever. If you have kind of like low beta, mid-range beta, and like fast beta or high beta, 12 to 15 is that beautiful state flexibility apex. You're going from alpha, where you're just sort of hanging out and observing, to engagement. 12 to 15 is that perfect, like you're speeding up right into betas. Mid-range betas, about 15 to maybe early 20s, that's where you pay attention to what's happening in your immediate environment, the immediate daily tasks of living. So mid-range betas is making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Which kid am I picking up first? What am I going to wear? How am I organizing out like what I'm doing? That is a lot of mid-range betas. High betas are more, the faster you go, the more abstract and less connected to you. Is God real? What am I doing with my life? Like, what's happening? Should I have sold my Tesla stock 2 months ago instead of right now? Like, these are sort of like the more externally oriented, like abstract stuff. This sweep starts off very body oriented, ranges up, and then stops in mid beta. Because what I'm not interested in doing with this one is taking you all the way out. What I'm interested in is grounding you, not just in your, we're starting with grounding you in your body, but now we want to leave you in, I am connected to my immediate environment. I don't want you just hanging out with slow wave, right? That's not really functional for most people. But we're gonna start body, and then we're gonna go for what is happening in this room. This is the concept behind why you might sequence slow to mid-range beta and leave someone in mid-range beta. What I'll do is give you the briefest little wrap-up tour of those handful of kind of protocol cascades that are available in the Neuro Pro 2 to help you guys start thinking through like what you could do with it, like some of the features. And then we're gonna shift over into EEG stuff, look at potentially some pre-post brain maps, and talk about integrating, like physically integrating EEG and photobiomodulation. There were 5 protocols, we looked at 2, but the focus one is just a beta protocol. But what I'll show you, because you'll see it's just beta all over, just full head, like I'm really trying to recruit beta. But what you'll notice is that we go mid-beta to high beta and then down to low beta. Remember what I said about mid-range beta? And then high beta is the more sort of abstract complex, and then low beta is right there kind of at that apex between alpha and like awareness and then engagement. Remember, the last thing that you give them is kind of where you leave them. So part of what we're doing in an experience or sort of an arc is we're trying to help the brain or the person explore the possibilities. A lot of us can't imagine things that we haven't had some indicator of. You know, like you can't imagine what is, like literally fill in the blank of stuff. You can't imagine what something's like until you've seen someone else do it, you've read it in a book, like you've watched a movie, and then you're like, wow, Inception. Okay, I'm gonna have a nap now. Like until you actually sort of encounter even the periphery of certain ideas, it's hard for us to imagine things that we don't understand. And we definitely can't build something that we can't imagine. So part of this today is us is even expanding out the perimeters a little bit of what we think is possible with the devices that we have. So this is full beta, like let's just, this is clearly going for the jugular, let's just engage you. But even though I'm trying to rev up a little bit, you'll notice I still leave them in low beta because I really don't want them just pegged out. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't stop it at any of these stages, because the way it works in the little software options is it kind of runs a little like a batch. Like each of these stages is its own separate little sub stage. So you can click go, it'll just go through them one after the other, but you can stop it at any point you want. So if you're like, well, what would it be like to do 11 minutes of high beta and then not go back down to low beta, have at it. Say flexibility and adaptability, honestly. So you'll notice that this one starts with a sweep, and every time I say sweep, there's usually some kind of 1 to 120 or 1 to 720 or 1 to 1,000. I'm looking for like a little bit of a full frequency, like a wide frequency sweep, which is a nice kind of stabilizer and opener. But also when you guys are picking stuff, what you're doing, because remember, if someone reminded me in the break, because I hadn't really articulated this explicitly, this is feed forward, not feedback. We really rely, a lot of what makes neurofeedback as effective as it is as a learning mechanism is stuff happens, and then we get to respond, and then our response changes the input, and then there's literally a conversation of mutual modulation occurring, which feels very personalized and attentive, and really supplements like the mechanisms of learning. This is why neurofeedback can be so effective, even when you're doing like the jankiest, like silly neurofeedback on like the worst device with the like the terriblest signal. You can still actually have effects because that loop, that mutually modulating loop where it recruits attention and then it modulates based on your responses. Like that's how everything works. When you don't have that mutual modulation, when you were just feed forward, the reason I'm like, hey, we could pick sequences of things is because instead of me just doing like 40 minutes of like one frequency to make sure you really get it, I can ask your brain to go on a little journey. There's variability. We're exploring different options. We're following the natural biological cascades of how your brain does different things and shifts through tasking states. But also I'm kind of leaning into this idea of the brain needs a little bit of variability. It needs a little bit of novelty to stay engaged. And it also needs a model. It can't do a thing that it can't imagine. So I'm modeling behaviors and behavior sequences. And in my opinion, this is what STIM or feed forward is really excellent at, is creating modeling. So we say, look, because we're relying on that frequency resonance, that frequency response. Like I'm stimming you with a frequency in a way that's hard for you to ignore. And so you're in your attempts to understand and learn something from it, you kind of get in the same range and you hang out and you're like, what does this mean? Because this is what brains do, right? What are the 3 questions brains ask? Is there a pattern? Does the pattern have anything to do with me? Because brains are people. And we're most interested in things that are relevant to us. Is there a pattern? Does the pattern have anything to do with me? And can I change it? Can I affect it? This is all your brain does all the time, right? And it prioritizes things that it feels it can impact because that's basic survival and efficacy and agency. And so when there is just the same thing happening over and over, your brain will engage, it will try to process, and then at some point it'll be like, there's not enough novelty here for me to continue to engage, so there'll be a decrease. Sometimes people talk about the biphasic response in photobiomodulation, the idea of like you go past the point where like now there's just less response because you've just either done it too long or too much or whatever. That's for anything. There's like a similar drop off for anything you're doing. This idea of, okay, can I do like a 20 or 30 minute protocol and create enough interest and variability that I keep the brain engaged? Because the natural engagement that happens with neurofeedback is the changing, the conversation. Well, if I'm not conversating, if this is a didactic lecture, how do I keep you interested? This is the variability component that you guys can consider. This one is that crossover alpha, kind of along the bottom of the brain. And then I've got a full head gamma sweep for like 11 minutes. This one goes from kind of mid-range to high gamma, and it just leaves you in gamma. That can be pretty engaging. So for some people, this could be delightful. Give me all the fast frequency, that helps me do the complex inhibition, and now I actually feel organized and relaxed and better because you basically gave me a stimulant. However, not everyone is going to love being left in gamma. And the last one that I put together is enhance. Now, there's another capability that the Neuro Pro 2 has, which is honestly pretty delightful, and that's the capacity for cross-frequency coupling, meaning that you can do two pulses at the same time in the same LED. So why is this useful? You guys have probably heard cross-frequency coupling getting tossed around. Cross-frequency coupling or trans-frequency coupling, or honestly, the idea of just, you got a bunch of different brain areas, and any of those areas at any point could be hanging out anywhere in the frequency range. So that dimensionality of different areas of your brain doing different things at the same time, the idea of getting them on the same wavelength, the coherence between, the synchrony between two regions, the more independent they are, the less they can communicate or exchange information. The more similar or coherent or synchronized two areas are, the more they can efficiently exchange information. Like anything else, it's a range. Too much coherence and you get entanglement and insufficient differentiation. Too much independence, you don't get enough communication or efficiency. This is why we like brain maps. Brain maps let us do a nice assessment where we basically record for some minutes, we put it through one of those fun analytical programs, and then it spits out a whole bunch of analytics saying, what is the brain doing in all these various different ways we can look at it? And then you guys can kind of cherry pick out the things that make the most sense. But when you think through, we've got network metrics that we can look at. We've got coherence and phase lag, and then we've got kind of more local, like the power, the absolute power, the relative power, and peak frequency. So we've got local and network things we can put together. So the idea of cross-frequency coupling is, part of the reason I chose a theta gamma is because theta gamma is a super fun cross-frequency coupling concept to just look at in the literature. If you think about gamma being very much the high level, managing our, connections to the external environment, doing all the fancy stuff, who's delivering lunch every day? Which frequency is the carrier wave for pulling a lot of those resources up into the cortex? So theta does a lot of the cortical resourcing. It's that nice carrier wave. There's a very interesting tesseract behavior between theta and gamma, because when you think about like a frequency speed of behavior, you know, nobody's brain is just manifesting 27 hertz out of the air. You literally start at 0. Then you speed up and you slow down and you speed up. And what that means is you're shifting. There's a certain amount of like, I don't know, distance is the right word. There's a certain amount of like kind of this is time space between your ability to move through different frequency tasking states. And so if you are hanging out in gamma in a handful of locations, your capacity to slow everything down into theta, to break for lunch, is going to really interrupt potentially sort of your ongoing productivity. So one of the very fun things, so this was conceptualized in the literature as high performers. High performers have this interesting theta gamma coupling. And it's like, you know, well, if you, again, reverse engineer from the penny gene direction, what they're literally saying is if you can kind of ongoing support, if you can theta level support, if there's that nice little shortcut between theta and gamma where it can feed you resources on sort of in an ongoing manner, your capacity to do gamma behaviors more sustainably over time, or even more complex gamma behaviors, we not only have like the theta resourcing component, but then you also have that integration from external to internal body. Because remember that long historical record of memory, not everybody accesses a historical record of memory in the same ways, but the majority of us, when we think about like sound or smell, or sometimes sight, and smell in particular, obviously I'm leaning in on that a little bit today, but when you think about the things that trigger emotional response in memory, there's strong encoding kind of subcortically that we were like the hippocampal element of recording memory and storing it. There were things that trigger access and retrieval, not always on purpose. And so when we're thinking about how do we simultaneously, as human beings, how do we simultaneously track things that are happening around us and also reference our historical record of things that have happened so that we can assess what's going on and then possibly predict into the future? How are we doing all of that? We've got a little theta gamma cross frequency coupling, and it's helping us like access historical record and memory and also like sustain physical. So there are things like there's all sorts of little. Alpha gamma is a fascinating cross frequency. Delta to beta, like when you think about why would they pair up and what would they be doing, like you'll never get out of that rabbit hole. This particular one, you'll notice we start off in like kind of a slow theta, bottom of the brain, and then we go into a cross frequency theta high gamma coupling. I think all the ones around the bottom are pulsing at a high gamma frequency and then have theta coupled up with it. The ones up at the top, I think maybe just these three. I can't remember if it's just these three or it's like these three and the parietals. But the ones at the top are straight gamma. Just gamma up at the top of the brain. We're expecting that kind of complex frequency stuff, right? But everything around the bottom is theta and gamma together. So we're creating that strong theta gamma foundation to then support that higher level gamma activity. And then you'll notice 10 minutes of alpha at the bottom of the brain for integrative purposes. You can absolutely stop it after stage 2 and hang out there. Why did I make this? Because we have one that is kind of alpha to mid-range beta for like nice body immediate grounding. We've got that flex that goes all the way out into high gamma and just leaves you out in gamma. And then we've got this one that allows you to stick a foot in slow, explore fast, but have the grounding. And then at the end, still integrate it together with that lower level alpha. All of these decisions, these are exploratory protocols. We've dumped them into the software. They come with the Neuro Pro 2. People are absolutely welcome to just try them out, try out the different stages, whatever they want. The reason they exist is to stimulate imagination. The principles of design are rooted in what do we know about EEG? What do we know about photobiomodulation? How do we make both things greater than the sum of their individual components? And this is what you guys will be doing out in the field. The more you know your tools, the more you have ideas for putting them together, Yeah, sky's the limit. Literally follow it up with a little alpha or low beta. Yeah. Maybe even slow alpha if they're really tweaking. You don't see it too often. The range between slow alpha, alpha, and slightly low beta, somewhere in there is usually somebody's happy spot. Alpha STIM is fascinating because, again, on the spectrum of very bossy to can choose to engage with, electrical cranial stimulation is quite dictatorial. It's very hard to ignore an electrical circuit like that. You know, you stick it on your ears and it completes that circuit. It's just gonna zap through the bottom of your brain, and there's not a lot you can do. For people who have a certain amount of consistent higher frequency kind of vigilance, you stick them on alpha STIM, I'd say about a fourth of those people are going to have almost an immediate stress response. They feel a little panicky, a little migrainey, a little nauseated, because we're literally saying, hey, you know this thing that you use to survive and rely on to function every day, stop doing that immediately. We're trying to literally pull them down into alpha, and they're like, that doesn't feel good to me. For people like that, you can eventually, it's not like exposure response, but you can introduce in a better way. It sounds a little bit silly, but it absolutely works. Weighted blankets, things that vibrate. There are various ways where you have to think about the bottom-up sensory inputs that help people feel grounded and connected. You can build over a handful of sessions. You can create other sensory grounding input experiences, because the first thing that you have to do, and again, this sounds colloquial, but it's real. People need to feel safe to feel relaxed. They need to feel relaxed to have a little bit of openness to something that's new or different or uncomfortable. So you've got to combine giving them some explanation, we put this on and you immediately didn't feel good. That's okay, we'll take it off. You immediately didn't feel good because your brain is doing an excellent job looking out for you. And it doesn't know what this is, and we haven't coaxed it into trying it out, into trusting. So you're a person who needs to be converted over some time, because brains are people. And so we take people who are kind of high-strung and easily stressed out and reactive, because remember, responsive and reactive aren't necessarily the same thing. People are high reactive, that's okay. We just put them on a slightly different arc, and we create more foundation for them. I think that tossed in a little HRV, tossed in a little breathing, there's no limitation, whatever you guys feel comfortable that you have in your toolbox, there's no limitation to creating foundation before you move on to other things that feel more invasive or more demanding. The only reason a lot of us hesitate, and this is just this is a practitioner self-management problem. A lot of us don't always feel comfortable with the idea of charging people $150 an hour to do a little breathing under a weighted blanket. We have a certain amount of needing to justify that they're getting good value for their money. And we also sometimes don't always know how to price out or think through I've got this really fancy equipment that was quite expensive and does complex things. And I've got this little HRV that plugs into your phone and does, whatever, right? And so sometimes we feel a little bit stressed about how to, because people talk, your people will talk. At some point they're gonna run into each other, hang out in the waiting room, they referred half their friends. So if somebody's showing up and they're getting a little breathing, right, and some vibration, and someone else is getting a full cap with a disco of lights, they're gonna be why am I not, how come they're getting, us having a good context for saying, listen, here's what you pay me for. You come in and you pay me an hourly rate, and for that hourly rate you get my time and my attention and my expertise that customizes what I'm doing to your needs and your specific treatment arc that will benefit you. And then you help them to understand things just because someone else is doing something different, that doesn't mean they're getting a better deal or they're better at braining than you are. There's a lot of client management that goes into doing sort of complex stuff. If you only have one thing you offer, everyone comes in and gets the same thing. And it's not that hard to explain. But when you start adding stuff in and it's different and people, so you have to introduce the idea of complexity and customization and being, you're paying me to help figure out what's going to be the best thing for you and your actual efficient recovery arc. But conceptually, if you guys start doing that heavy management in the front end, that's why I was like, tell them the first 10 sessions is literally dialing in. Tell them that we're having a conversation with your central nervous system, and you and I together are going to listen to it and we're going to adjust. I'm paying attention to you. You're part of how we, those things, I mean, they seem kind of silly and obvious to say, but a lot of times we just sort of forget how much people need to have explanation about what's going on, and just regular reassurance, not dismissive reassurance. Slow down and actually say, what is the thing that you're stressed out about right now? Let's figure out how to give you the information or the weighted blanket or whatever it is you need. And in the end, I really think the most useful outcome tool I have is just good client management. I think 70% of client satisfaction is feeling that you paid attention to them, you did things that made sense to them, and then you helped them learn how to pay attention to themselves and what's changing. So they come out of it going, I feel something did change, but I believe it changed because you showed me some stuff, and then you asked me some stuff, and now I'm noticing stuff. That there's a lot of people out there who are very reactive to things, and they don't do a great job of thinking through it themselves. So they'll get like a simplistic fear, and they'll freak out about it, bring it to you, and now you're trying to kind of manage them. The ideal clients are the ones that sort of read up, think through stuff, come in with the informed questions, you tell them a couple things, they've already made the connections, and now they're excited and ready to give you money. That is not most of them. So having your own understanding of what's going on and being able to relay that to them, that is a skill that I genuinely think is worth spending time developing. We talked a lot about feed forward. Let's talk about some feedback. I started off with pulsed electromagnetic field, just little baby microtesla coils. I've been doing independent and concurrent and sequential STIM with neurofeedback since 2004. But I didn't start integrating STIM, umbrella term, for photobiomodulation or pulse EMF or whatever. I didn't start integrating STIM in as part of the neurofeedback cycle until maybe about 10 years ago. What I wanted to do was to just see what happened if I did stuff, which is most of how I end up doing things, is I'm just what if I put this and this and this together? What would happen? To be fair, after more than a decade of kind of direct practice and working with a lot of different options and trying to figure out how to cobble them together, electromagnetic field has a significant environmental propagation field effect. So this is one of the things that I would recommend less for people who are pretty compromised, for practitioners to do all day long standing in the room getting hit with it, potentially, and also for people who are maybe doing more complex sensitive neurofeedback options. Just because there's absolutely a lot of field effect, it's going to end up in your signal. There are things you can do. If you're pulsing your little stims at 15 hertz or whatever, you can take out, depending on what it is you're doing, you can provide feedback on frequency ranges that are not the one that's being stemmed. So depending on what your software does, you can literally just say, I'm going to provide feedback based on behaviors in delta, theta, and low alpha, and then I'm going to skip fast alpha and low beta, and then we'll start again at mid-range because I'm stemming in the 12 to 15 range. So you can absolutely just take out wherever the pulsing is and just not provide feedback on those specific frequency ranges. And honestly, that mitigates a good bit of that pulse artifact. There's no way to take out the hum. I mean, there's just DC power changes that happen near the head whenever you're using any kind of electrical device. So you can't make all that go away. You'll see that show up in real time, like you will if you plug in your laptop or your phone goes off. That will end up in the signal. This has a lot, microtesla has a lot of kick. Pulse EMF has a lot of kick. I can't really tolerate a ton of it, partially because of long-term health problems that have made me a little sensitive and reactive, and I don't process a lot of energy demand. I just don't like being demanded upon. So So for me, photobiomodulation was a really nice next option because it still has a certain amount of oomph, but doesn't create that sort of demanding field effect. I think pulsed EMF is fantastic, and I have had some really excellent results with it. But I was looking for another kind of middle range, like less bossy option. So photobiomodulation ended up being a really excellent kind of mid-range option. When Lou gave me permission to use the BrainMaster system to drive some of his photobiomodulation devices a few years ago, we ended up kind of doing, you'll notice like Bill has like the older model on. We ended up using, so that originally like that, is this a Neuro Duo 2? I don't know which version this is, but we ended up basically driving one of the older headsets, and at some point, Lou, and I think I've got pictures of this as well, Lou allowed one of his people to pull the LEDs apart and just give me the actual loose LEDs so I could arrange them in a couple of different ways myself. And so what I was doing is I was running neurofeedback, and the fundamental way that I've designed these things, and I think I'm going to stick with this for, ironically, possible FDA clearance concerns in the future. One of the things that has emerged in the conversation around if you're putting a bunch of stuff together, the FDA likes things separated and simple, and if you start putting things together, they get very fussy about it. Right now, the way that these protocols run is when the auditory and or visual feedback is going, like there's like a threshold, right? You meet a certain amount of threshold. When the auditory and visual feedback is kicking in because you've met those thresholds, the STIM, whatever it is off. When you drop below the threshold that you're meeting for the auditory and visual, the STIM kicks on. So there's an ongoing continuous like auditory, visual, STIM, visual, STIM, sound, STIM. So the whole session, because it's ongoing, it's not, I don't do runs, I do however long we're gonna go, continuous. You get continuous proportional multivariate feedback over time. Now, the reason I'm describing to you in the level of detail I am is that whatever the LEDs are, like we're mainly working in the 810 nanometer range, you have the inherent efficacy of the 810, but whatever you pulse it at is another layer of potential information. So that in and of itself, standalone photobiomodulation, awesome. But then you take that 810, you pulse it at whatever, 10 hertz, just as an example, and then you have that 810 pulsing at 10 hertz turning off and on based on changes in your real-time EEG. Now you have made it part of the feedback conversation, where previously the learning was to some degree limited by how much we could recruit and interest the brain. Now I don't have to recruit. I've got you. Remember, because the two colliculi at the bottom of your brain that orient your attention in space, the inferior and the superior colliculus, the superior colliculus is recruited by visual inputs and the inferior is recruited by temporal inputs. So if I've got a little audio visual happening, this is why neurofeedback works as well as it does, I've got your attention. You don't have to voluntarily give it to me. I'm drawing it from environmental stimulus. If I've got your attention, now whenever the sound goes off, the light kicks on. And then whenever the light goes off, the sound kicks on. So now I've got principles of contra STIM, I've got principles of continuity, I've got novelty, I've got conversation. So you guys can imagine just sliding a photobiomodulation LED in there and turning it off and on in the middle of a feedback loop could have potentially really positive results. Part of what we're trying to do is understand like the power and connectivity elements, what putting it together potentially does. I say like understand. So when I say Z-score training, what I mean is a protocol paradigm that allows for me to select out whatever sites I want. This is a snapshot of one of the elements in the BrainMaster software, one of the screens, that lets me then choose whatever sites I want to base the feedback on, but then it lets me choose what metrics I want to calculate and what frequency bands I want to calculate them in. So when I say things like give the brain context, if I'm asking it to tell me 8 times a second, what is the brain doing at each of these locations in each of these frequencies, right? In absolute and relative power, that's a lot of metrics for one independent location. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for Z-scores that persist. I'm looking for the high and the low ones that stay high and low. The whole point of looking at a map or doing quote-unquote Z-score feedback is the metrics that are less flexible and adaptable, the ones that say pegged out at like 4+ standard deviations or 3.5 below norm. The reason that something like that is informative is it's identifying behaviors, brain behaviors that are not adaptable. They are just persisting in whatever it is they're doing. So when you guys are looking at a brain map and you're like, look, it's red, it's blue, those are persistent, non-adaptable behaviors. So the other thing that's useful is being able to have the networking. There is always that Charles Hebbian implied what fires together, wires together idea that you can do like a little SMR at C4 and the whole brain has to get together to change, the source has to change for the surface to change, and like, of course. But that's given like a simple concept and then asking for the brain to figure out and contextualize it. If I can give the brain a little more context, hey, what are you doing in all the frequency bands locally, and also what are you doing in coherence between each of these possible pairs across that full spectrum? Now I've got a lot of data points in real time. I'm watching the brain do a bunch of stuff in real time. How does that translate into asking the brain to do things? So let's say I've got 900, didn't I tell y'all to not do too much? 900 metrics that are a pile of possible brain behaviors we're monitoring. Now remember, if we're comparing them to a Z-score range, that means at any given point, all the flexible ones are going to be kind of hanging out in the middle of the range, and there are going to be some percentage of them that are pegged out high or low and they're not moving. What I care about is, can we get some movement, some adaptability? Can we introduce some variability into that possibly pathological or problematic persistence? How do I communicate that to the brain? Now, how do I get the brain to wiggle those ones on the end without messing up possible adaptive individual performance capabilities? Remember earlier when I said the 30 hours a week that they do a thing? Like the little 2 or 3 hours a week of neurofeedback I do is not going to override that. Like, listen, I feel that we're all big believers in the power of neurofeedback, and for good reasons. But everything is neurofeedback. Everything that happens to you all day long is stuff coming in and you trying to figure out how to respond to it. Neurofeedback is useful because we get to cut through some of that noise and do some really specific requests. So we can do like specialized learning requests, and that's fantastic. Like, nothing replaces that. But let's say I want to support better networking. We talked about the local state persistence. If you can't adapt, I can't network you in at the alpha level or the gamma level. Like, how am I supposed to get that local regional guy in to do complex networking? I need for that local persistence to move. But I need for it to move if you don't need it, not if you do. So how am I supposed to be like, here brain, pick the stuff you don't need anymore and leave the stuff you do? We have to rely to some degree on the regular reinforcement of that daily and weekly experience. I think that's reasonable. But what we could do is we could give the brain more choice. So the way that this protocol design works is it says, okay, we got 900 possible things you can move around. If you can get 50% of those in whatever range I pick, like 1.5 standard deviation window, whatever it is, you can get like 50% of those metrics in the window at any given point, you're doing fantastic. Now you get the sound and the bleeps and the whatever's and the visuals. I don't care which 50% you get to pick. The way that the sound feedback works is 50% gives you a tone, 51% gives you a slightly higher tone, 52% gives you a slightly higher tone, which means the more percentages you get in, the higher the tones go. Now we're introducing novelty, and we're introducing the innate response set that we all have to higher tones, which we know is real because of shrieking babies and beeping fire alarms. At some point, higher frequencies are very difficult to ignore. They're more attention drawing for us. We call it annoying, I call it effective. So the higher the frequency, the higher the sound note, the more likely it is to draw the brain's attention. Well, for the brain to get higher frequency notes, it has to pull more of those peripheral pegged out z-scores into the range. It has to like make those stuck areas, forgive the colloquial language, it has to make those persistent areas move to pull them into that range. But because I didn't tell them which ones, like if I got eight sites like this is a decent bit of network coverage, right? I've got intrahemispheric pairs, I've got front and back, I've got diagonal, all the possible coherence and phase I could be looking at. I'm asking for a lot of options, but I'm like, I don't care, pick whichever 50% you want. So what naturally occurs is that the brain goes, what do I need? What do I use? What is being regularly reinforced all week long? And what is not? So those hypervigilant, trauma residual, extra fast beta that you make now because when you were a kid, maybe your mom was terrible and an alcoholic and you had to like pay attention when she came home, if she like what mood she was in so you didn't get smacked, and like all the horrible possible reasons why we like might have hypervigilant persistent beta that doesn't allow for other things that are functional, whatever that is. If you have now moved into a different place, you are safe, you have a job, you have friends, you're 38, like you're not 6 anymore, you've still got these persistent patterns sometimes, these residual patterns, but do you need them to survive? No. But nobody's explained to your brain that you have options, right? Like it's just there. Well, we've got some other high beta around being like, a professional golfer, right? We've got some other pockets of atypical activity for doing whatever peak performance or professional thing, right? So we've got options. So you come and you start seeing me, I start giving your brain feedback when it pulls more of those pegged out, persistent z-scores, brain behaviors, starts pulling more of those into the middle, meaning like make them more adaptable, but it gets to pick. So what do you think the brain's gonna pick to adapt? It's gonna pick the stuff that's not being regularly reinforced in your daily environment. So the principles here are choices, flexibility, options, but also the principles are we're relying on how things work. Like the things I'm telling you, like I feel like I can say this and you're all gonna be like, yeah, that totally makes sense because this is just how stuff works, right? Like I'm not saying anything new or weird. And I think sometimes when we talk about neurofeedback, it feels very weird and alien to a lot of people. And we use words they aren't used to hearing and we try to explain how, it does operant conditioning and like whatever we're doing, right? If you're just like, listen, you don't have to understand how this works for it to work. Whoa, you have to pay attention. How do babies learn? Do babies have to understand how learning works to learn something? There's just basic principles of how the brain interacts with the environment, absorbs information, tries to do useful things with it. We've cherry-picked some things out over the years because we like being able to explicitly, consciously track something. And that's great for us. But the reality is there's some very innate, natural principles for why this works. It has nothing to do with like the kind of complex learning behavior stuff that we talk about. Part of the reason I talk about this is I'm like, listen, you guys already know everything that you need to know to make sense out of this and explain it to people. No one just told you. You already know stuff. And so when you say things like this to people and they start to understand all this is doing is a slightly customized learning conversation, introducing some information to your brain gets to figure out what works for it. That means you can do the same identical protocol, where before this was distressing. Before, like, we're doing 10 hertz on everybody and getting like 50 different responses, and that seemed kind of like, how are we supposed to figure anything out? That's actually the reason it works. The reason it works is because you take 50 people and you put them in a university course, some interesting stuff. They're all coming with their own historical records, their own career plans, their own priorities. Everyone's bringing their own thing. They're all going to get the same curriculum, but they're going to walk out of it with very different applications and learning. This is the same thing that's happening with photobiomodulation and neurofeedback. We introduced a little 10 hertz photobiomodulation, and you get all these different brain responses because of the context and the individuality. If we stop thinking it has to be a very specific brain response, and we start thinking, we just want a response. That means the brain's receptive to and able to learn. We want a response. And then what we want to do is figure out the wider principles: state flexibility, better processing speed, but ultimately everything's going to exist in the natural brain behavior cascades. So, if we can take the network capabilities of neurofeedback and the power production synaptogenic capabilities of photobiomodulation and put them together, what happens? The answer is lots of cool things. And so I'm going to show you some of them. This particular one, you can see from the red shape, that was the older model with the 4 LEDs. There's no intranasal here. This was a 4 LED setup, and I just stuck my 8 electrodes underneath it, stuck that on top, and we went to town. The thing that's important to know potentially about this case is that this person had a lot of executive function difficulty, high anxiety, a lot of insomnia, a lot of stress. They particularly had trouble with verbalization when they would get stressed out. So there's one of those people that kind of more, that strong freeze effect. Let's say situational dependent expressive aphasia. Some people have like situational dependent tinnitus, like it comes and goes depending how stressed they are, which sounds crazy, but it totally does. There's a handful of things that worsen depending on your stress levels. So her expressive aphasia absolutely, and honestly, she has a lot of potential indicators because she also can't, she mixes up words. So she does have some verbalization challenges in general. Remember I was going on about alpha peak frequency and that you could look at the alpha peak frequencies of the individual. This is the QEEG Pro analytics suite. So one of the commercialized database products where you can upload an EEG and get some analytics. One of the things they do is this nice little alpha peak frequency map, head map. And you can see that it's alpha peak frequency, the actual peak frequency, and then the Z-score of how typical it is to hang out at that frequency at that location. Because we are actually looking for slightly faster and slower peak frequencies depending on which location it is. We're not expecting everybody to just be doing the same thing necessarily. Now, what is interesting, and I do want to emphasize this, when we're looking at a power map, we're looking at high and low power, right? So red means there's a lot of voltage, and blue means there's less than we're expecting. But when you're looking at alpha peak frequency, it's not high and low, it's fast and slow. So something that's reddish or orangish is going to be a faster frequency, and something that's blue is going to be a slower frequency. So we got a spread, what is it, 7.9 to 12. That's a pretty wide spread. Why do we care about that? Well, that means the frontals and this little sensory motor spot are really not going to be able to connect, synchronize, and communicate very easily. So what we did was that was the baseline prior to doing anything. The sessions was that little 8-channel Z-score protocol that I showed you and kind of walked you through how it worked. The session was, maybe 20, 30 minutes of that. And then the 4-channel headset was 10 hertz. So basically it was stimming at 10 and it would go off and on based on those threshold descriptions. So it was sound and visual, 10 hertz, photobiomodulation, sound, visual, back and forth, continuously. So this was one single session. I think it was about 25 minutes. So I took a full EEG, waited 2 days, and then just took another one and was like, what happened? What changed? In those 2 days, she went to work, she did stuff, she came back, I took a follow-up, and I was like, what were the last 2 days like after we did this one single session on you? Small caveat. There is absolutely transient variability in QEEG. At least 15, maybe 18% of what you see, what the findings end up being, have some transient effects. What time of day, what else happened, etc. But I would say a good 85%, and I say this because literature, but I also say this because I have people that I have been taking data on for 20 years. like these longitudinal, like a half a dozen people. I've just been brain mapping them, and a couple of them have had nothing in between. And so the steady reliability of how similar those brain maps look over years apart when they haven't really had anything in between them actually is a little shocking. If you aren't doing stuff to change the brain pattern, usually the transient effects are not going to be super dramatic. You're going to see some reliability. So if there's no drugs being introduced, if there's no like brain injury, I absolutely acknowledge that sometimes pre-post data can suffer from the limitation of possible variability. But 2 days later, she comes back in, I do another map. You'll notice a couple of things. I said, how did the last 2 days go? And she said, you know, it's really interesting. She said, I definitely felt more chill. I definitely felt like I was able at work under stress to think better and make better decisions. She was like, the only thing that I did notice that I didn't feel any improvement at all was like that verbal recall and expression. She was like, I felt less stressed. I felt like I was operating better, but I still really struggled to verbalize. Now, look what we got. Look where that slow alpha shifted over to. That is a 7.9 over there at T5. That's pretty slow. Now, previously T5 was okay. Now, T5 is dropped. But look what's happened up at the front. For some people, that high alpha peak is not peak performance. It is anxiety. Look at this. Now we have almost a whole brain that's almost a whole brain is about a hertz apart. That's pretty good global synchrony. Who's the party pooper? Left temporal. And what happens in left temporal? What do we know that there's a certain amount of verbalization. Where is the part that's the most different and the farthest away? Expressive and receptive. You need that whole arcuate fascicula to work to make it go. This was just super interesting to me. Like, obviously, I'm just gonna show you guys like literally data. I'm showing you these little case studies, these little one-offs in some ways. But watching the brain move like this and then having them tell me what their experience was and being able to see a story happen, that is very interesting to me. So the way that this protocol works is probably close to a little language model. I wouldn't call it AI because I think a lot of what we're calling AI is mostly just language modeling and a certain amount of complex pattern recognition and some IFTT, fancy IFTT. But the idea of being like, can we adapt in real time? 100%. I wouldn't call this maybe what you're calling AI. And I do think there is a lot of potential for wider complex, more targeted thresholding and contingencies to be built into protocols like this, 100%. The reason that this works the way that it does is because a lot of times when we think about how to identify and create trains of contingencies or decision making, a lot of times we are thinking about like the longitudinal, I'm looking at what power does over time. So I'm gathering my data and I'm saying, oh, the microvolts are going up and down, or oh, so we're looking for like these sort of longer baselines of activity. And that's how we get a lot of data samples to average over to get like a wider idea of what's happening and then make those maybe decisions. In something like this, I am taking the concept of averaging a bunch of samples over time and I am making it vertical. And what I mean by that is instead of doing it over time, because what we need is a bunch of data samples for context, that 900 metrics that's happening, being calculated 8 times a second, you're basically getting a pile of data samples, but you're getting it simultaneously instead of a bunch of them over time. Still representational, but representational in a different way. So the reason I'm describing this is because I think that we tend to think about conversations and feedback as linear, and we think about the data collection over time as linear, as we should, of course it is. But then when we come to having the conversation, asking the brain to do a series of complex things and having it be responsive, that was what I was really trying to crack 20 years ago, like what is actually possible with what we can do. And so when you have a median range, so the whole idea of a z-score is there's like a average somewhere in there, there's like a median, and then you're like, are you above it or are you below it? How far above? Oh, how many standard deviations? How much you deviate from the standard? So if you're like 2 standard deviations out, that's really significant. Yeah, what is that, like 96% or something? I can't remember. You basically have like a referential point, and then you're just saying like how far out is the behavior from maybe the expected referential point. So when you take something like this, the way the paradigm works, so we've got that nice little median range, we set our little, 1.5 standard deviations. So you've got how far is the brain behavior out from the range? But then you've got those external thresholds essentially. You actually have, instead of like in traditional neurofeedback where you have a threshold and you can be above or below it, you've only got 2 places you can be. Are you above or you below? In this one you actually have 4 quadrants. You can be above inside the range or above outside the range or below. You actually have 4 places the brain can be. Now you have additional dimensions of spatial aggregate behavior, which means that if I introduce that percentage demand, I want half of my metrics inside the internal range. Half of them can be in the external range, and I'm literally tracking where everything is simultaneously. Then when more of them aggregate move into the internal range, it triggers that little sound frequency increase. What ends up happening is that there actually is a very sensitive kind of complex response that is based on the movement between the quadrants, what percentage of which metrics are where. This is taking that sort of longitudinal and making it vertical and simultaneous was the only way I could think to make this a quick, responsive, but complex model. And I realize I'm saying things that are probably like sound crazy. Also, like programming and physics aren't like my training, but the principle of, can I ask the brain to do a bunch of things simultaneously? That's what we built in. Can that be modeled out using what you're calling AI? Yes, but we would be introducing just a little bit more time delay into the processing, which would make it slightly less simultaneous. There are ways to think through that, and I would be certainly happy to have additional conversation. I think the future of what we're trying to do with like more remote neurofeedback and more accessible home use support, I think a lot of what we're doing with the modeling is going to make that viable, 100%. In fact, if you come to ISNR, I'll have more things to say about that. Remember, you can pick any of the 19 you want. I picked those 8 because it gives me like some nice sort of front, back, side to side network coverage because I'm interested in networks. Let's say you could pick anything. I can slide the headset back and forth. You can pick anything. You saw this result. And remember, whatever you're picking, you have the advantage of you don't have to choose beta this or alpha that. It's all in there contextually being monitored and offered as options. So all you have to do is pick where you want the sites to go, and then the connectivity and the local adaptability are built into the feedback component. Because that's part of what I was trying to do with this was make it like real easy. You don't have to pick which frequencies go where and what goes up and down because remember I said earlier, how do we know we're gonna pick? I'm not saying everyone who does neurofeedback traditionally has a God complex. I'm saying some of us understand that with great power comes great responsibility, and we don't love the responsibility part. We love the idea of the person we're working with having more agency and autonomy around advocating for their own health and improvement. I really love to hand as much agency and responsibility back to the individual. So there's like all the conversation we have around what they could be doing, but then there's also me implementing that concept into the software where I'm like, listen, I will pick stuff that I'm trying to network together, and I'll pick places I'm trying to create more adaptability. But I'll pick that. I'll pick what I think we should pay attention to, and then your brain gets to decide which of those elements is going to pull together. So if that's the principle you have, you just got to pick locations. And then you have all 19 channels. Then what would you potentially do next? If you're going to think through the hubs, like what are the trigger hubs that I can grab that really give me the most widest networking effect almost all of it's going to be this stuff here, with the caveat for I get tremendously useful benefits out of doing a 4-channel T3, C3, C4, T4. Obviously that full sensory motor strip is honestly quite irreplaceable as like a baseline option, but kind of anywhere in here, these are the main hubs for that interhemispheric. There's a more corpus callosal connections between the homologous sites, the ones that are same on either side. You get those homologous pairs, you're going to have way more networking potential between them. So I'm a fan of doing roughly homologous placements because I've got the connectivity networking stuff built into that. Speaking of connectivity, this is the same data set, the 2 days later, the one session, the 2 days later. This was her 1 to 20 hertz coherence metrics. Again, like, I wasn't expecting that. Here's her 21 to 40 hertz. I was not expecting this. I don't see this every time. I certainly don't see this every time with one session, but this is one of the very earlier ones I did. Like, you could see how old that headset, like, this was several years ago. And this is one of the very kind of, I think, first 2 or 3 I did. And this is part of what compelled me that there was something here. Because this is one of the people I've done longitudinal EEGs on. I've seen this person's brain change and not change over time. This is a very resistant brain in some ways. And so I was a little shocked. This is one of the first times I'd done that combination. This is phase. And this was also super interesting. So this is the 1 to 20. This was also what was very interesting to me was, and again, I double checked. Whenever I see this kind of spaghetti garbage, I'm always assuming a certain amount of artifact or user error. So I went back in and kind of like triple checked that this was actually viable data, not just a bunch of eye blink artifact down in Delta. It was legit. One of the things that we rely on Delta for is that repair and regeneration tasking. You guys will sometimes do maps on people and you will see dramatic increases in the reds and the blues in that second and third map. And I think for some people that's quite stressful because we're looking at maps like, oh, we proved you got better by making the red and the blue go away. If you tell them that at the beginning, you are painting yourself into an unfortunate corner, and I recommend not doing that. I actually do have a really good little summary on how to look at, what did I call it? How to explain the second and third map to the client without having a panic attack. I can't remember what I called it, but I have a good little like hour rambling webinar of me talking about that. And if you email brainstarrinnovations@gmail.com and say, can I have Penny Jean's panic attack map webinar or whatever it is, I'll make sure you get it. It is very interesting to me because I'm going to show you a few more data sets. I see a significant amount of increases and shifts in power and network behavior. I have zero concern about the reds and the blues becoming more. What I'm interested in is, are things changing? And is the brain essentially exploring, learning, and trying out parameters and different arrangements? And I think if you guys think about it that way and you talk to people, that first brain map is a nice little starting point. But I tell people, I don't really know what's going on. So we've done about maybe 10 sessions and like your second brain map. I have no idea how your system's going to respond to anything we're doing until I give it some info and it gives me some info back. And then we talk about how that felt for you. That's why I'm like, I know it's difficult to be a little vague. Sometimes I'll say more simple, clear, less vague things, obviously, to people that I work with, because you kind of have to dial it down. But to you guys, for your own stress management, if you do a second map and it's just reds everywhere, you know what red means? Red means activity. Red means activity. That's not bad. Suddenly it's just beta coherence everywhere. Well, you know what, you can't have red coherence without organization. And you cannot build infrastructure that wasn't there neurally without activity and organization. So like almost all the things you're probably stressing about, most of those are either a bunch of red because they got sick in between the two maps. Like, ask them questions, you know, did you have a fender bender? Did you, like, if there's something really unexpected, obviously there could have been an antecedent event. But if there wasn't, and it's literally just their brain trying stuff, how is that bad as opposed to just what it's doing? Part of the thing that's really interesting to me about coherence is if we think about coherence, literally how coherent or how similarly the two areas behave. When we talk about not being able to understand someone, we might use the term incoherent because we're not on the same wavelength. You have to be on the same wavelength to exchange information in an efficient way. And so two signals behaving similarly, the more similarly they behave, the more coherent they are. So when you see red coherence, that's a lot of similarity, sometimes not enough independence. But when you see blue coherence, that's insufficient similarity, which means that information is not being sent back and forth very effectively. So all these blue coherence lines, her saying, I'm having trouble with processing speed, I can't think very well, I'm not able to really put it together. And then her saying 2 days later, you know, I felt like that was easier for me. To me, this is increased coherence, more informational exchange. That last phase one, if coherence is like how much information, phase is about phase lag. This doesn't say phase lag, but this is phase lag. So lag time meaning there's a certain amount of speed that we expect signals to move at. If we've got a little old lady from Birmingham and a hotshot from Boston, if he's talking very rapidly and it's too rapidly she can't follow, the packets of information are coming too quickly, there's not enough lag in between the words, she can't follow, so she's not able to really, you know, it's inefficient communication. Then she starts trying to tell him about her biscuit recipe, and there's like 9 seconds between every word. He can't follow because it's too slow. So there is actually a pacing to signaling. We expect there to be different lag times between different locations, a little bit further apart, a little bit closer together, but there's actually standardized ranges for how much lag time in signaling we expect between different ranges, different areas in different frequency bands. When you see, this is 1 to 20 hertz, when you see blue, that means there is, because it's red is a lot of whatever we're measuring, blue is not a lot of whatever we're measuring. So when it was coherence, red was a lot of coherence, a lot of information, and blue was not much information being exchanged. Where phase lag, red is a lot of lag, and blue is not much lag. So blue means less lag time, which means signals moving faster, which again, I guess maybe and then red is a lot of lag time, signals moving slower. Okay, now my Birmingham and Boston is looking real good. So red state, blue state, we went from a lot of, like not a lot of lag to more lag time in the delta. This is interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One being, again, she's got a history of like brain injury and illness and lots of other stuff. What do we know delta does? Like, what is the point of it? Repair, healing, regeneration. So whenever I see a jump in the slow waves up in the cortical regions, I'm like, something needed repairing. There needs to be found, signals don't start at 27 hertz. You have to build stuff bottom up. For all that upper network to change, I thought this was a little interesting, especially because she was so blue and then she pendulumed red. Everything else, because this is 21 to 40, you'll notice like this was just foundational and everything else kind of cleared up a little bit. So to me that says you have to have bottom up foundational work sometimes to make full spectral changes. Let's start off with intranasal. For example, here's what you guys need to know about these pictures. Each of the little 3 sets of images is the same brain. The crosshairs is the same location. What it's trying to do is show it to you from 3 different angles so you can get a good feel for where that crosshair area is physically. Part of what is of interest to me is you'll notice these little color bars with percentage of deviant voxels. Voxels just meaning they've taken the whole brain and they've broken it up into like maybe 62, 6,300 little squares of space, cubes of space, and they're essentially saying we're tracking every individual cube of space and what it's doing, and here are all the voxels that are in the standard deviation or out of the standard deviation range. So this is like 35% of the brain activity is looking pretty normal, 5% is outside of 2 standard deviations. That's like a whole brain summary indicator Whereas the crosshairs is saying out of the whole brain, what was the most extreme finding? And the most extreme finding in this one was 2.8 standard deviations of theta over here in the superior parietal, like kind of the left parietal. When we were looking at changes here, this was almost 3 standard deviations of 4 Hertz activity in this left parietal. This was the baseline theta. The STIM component was 1 LED in the front left nostril, and then combined with just this one single LED in the back. So we've got 1 intranasal, 1 cerebellum placement. 10 Hertz, 20 minutes. So we had 20 minutes of just 1 in the back. I did a baseline, we ran the 20 minutes. 15 minutes after that 20 minutes, I did another baseline. 30 minutes after that 20 minutes, I did a second baseline, and an hour after that 20 minutes, I did a fourth one. This is theta activity. Prior to doing anything, ran 20 minutes of 10 Hertz STIM. This was theta activity 15 minutes after I ran that 20 Hertz. Now remember where it was, nasal and cerebellum. Okay, look at these numbers. 2.8 went up to 4.8 standard deviations. See these little numbers here? We went from 35, 5, and 0, we went up to 67, 19, and 6. That's a significant increase in theta activity. All right, half an hour later, we've dropped to 3.3, and we got 45, 5, and 1. Now, this was our baseline, 35, 5, went up to 67, 19, 6, and this is 3 standard deviations, 6% of the brain. Dropping back down, and here's what we got an hour later. So original was 2.8. We have dropped down to 2.2 an hour later. And look at the numbers. We went from 35 and 5 and 0 to 18, 0, and 0 with a little smidge over here down in the negatives, like a little low activity. I want you also to notice something else. The actual distribution of where that theta was hanging out. Previously in the back, more parietal, a little sensory motor, shifted all the way in front of the brain. Suspicion, some of that intranasal power. This was just 1, 10 Hertz. Now we've got a right frontal. Now we're hanging out right frontal, less theta. But before it was left parietal, we've moved diagonally, almost a contra-coup, up to the right parietal. There's a couple things I know about this case. One of them being is that there was a coup-contra-coup head injury in the history. I did not expect this. I'm going to show you a little bit more data in this specific case. I'm pointing this out because one of the things I have been doing is doing a baseline, doing some photobiomodulation STIM, and then doing 15, 20, 30 minutes, an hour, like doing multiple ones, trying to watch that dynamic change. Because a lot of times when we do QEG, we're doing a map and like 20 sessions of stuff, and then like 3 months later, another map. Totally okay, but there was so much sensitive change happening in real time, even sometimes session to session. This is way too much data to be given anybody on a regular basis, but it's useful for us understanding maybe the impact of some of the stuff that we're doing. Because the impact I'm going for here is it doing stuff? Same thing. 10 Hertz, nasal and cerebellum, 10 Hertz for 20 minutes. We were looking at theta, now we're looking at gamma. This is what happened in gamma, same brain. So this is our baseline. Something I'm going to point out, see this little bitty blue spot here? And see how we got like 27 and 6 in the negatives? Interesting, sticky note that. Our most extreme z-score was a 3.3 gamma, again parietal. We got a 9 and a 2 and a whatever down here. That's fine. This is 15 minutes after we did the 20-minute STIM. And you'll notice we went from 3.3 to 2.7. That's fine. Half an hour later, we are down 2.6. An hour later, we're down to 2.3. Notice how this didn't budge at all. Like there's no moving around. We just
right on top of that parietal cortex. And what we saw, reasonable-ish decrease. The ultimate, like we had a 13.2. And here's what's actually interesting about this. Let's do it one at a time. 27 and 6% on the blue. 600, 600, 400. Clearly there was some shifting in this little blue spot that we're going to look at next. The more drama was in like the plus in the red in the picture. That increased a little bit and then calmed down. There wasn't a lot of big movement, but look at this. This is the EEG superimposed onto some fMRI slices, bottom of the brain, all the way up to top of the brain. Bottom of the brain up to top. So that means whenever, if it starts earlier up in here, that means it started lower in the brain, and this is like top of the brain. This is 39 hertz. Remember that little bitty blue spot that we saw earlier? This is it. This is a significant frontotemporal lack of gamma engagement. So I'm gonna put a sticky note on that. This individual that I did this on was a gentleman who has a lot of anhedonia. He's a person who like really just doesn't enjoy interacting with people. He doesn't enjoy talking. He's very kind of recalcitrant, very depressed, not easily engaged. Doesn't like his day job where he has to interact with humanity. He's not a talkative guy, not a very interactive person. So we've got not a talkative guy. So we got gamma, which is that engagement, over in the left temporal, frontotemporal, not a lot of engagement in an area that might run talking, verbalize. I got 2 verbalization cases for you, different ones. So this was his baseline, 39 hertz. This was 15 minutes after STIM, 30 minutes after STIM, 1 hour after STIM. This is the same thing, 40 hertz. You don't have to really see so much as just look at the colors. This is 42 hertz and 43 hertz. 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour post, it held. Sometimes I see a bounce back. Sometimes I'll see a mediating effect and then like an hour later it'll poof, bounce back. Sometimes I'll see dramatic increases and then in the 30 minutes, whatever, and then an hour later it'll settle. It's very interesting to watch it. And then this is 44 hertz and 45 hertz. Now remember that 44 was where we were seeing that kind of entrenched red that didn't move much. You'll see when we break it out a little bit that there was some improvement over time. But the thing that interested me the most, in that hour, and it was like maybe, let's say it was 2 hours, hooked them up, took the baseline, ran the protocol, waited 15 minutes, ran another one, waited 30, waited an hour. It was roughly 2 hours I got him sitting there. He came in grumpy, shoulders up around his ears, not talkative. In those 2 hours, I have known this person easily 20 years. He turned into an unrecognizable motor mouth. I was stunned, and I was especially stunned because remember, we stimmed at 10 hertz. This was, I didn't stim him at 40. I think if I stimmed it at 40, I think this would have automatically made sense. I'm like, yeah, I dialed him up, No, this was 10 hertz. The change in gamma in specific from just that 10 hertz. So I was like, what in the freaking world? Well, nasal and that cerebellum. This was early in the game. I didn't know the stuff I told you earlier about all the networking and the subcortical and the thing. I didn't know any of that. But I was like, I chose the intranasal and the cerebellum because I was like, well, let's just see what we can do on the bottom of the brain. And how, I can't see a lot of subcortical stuff with this Oscillations imaging. It gets me down to the bottom of the cortex with a certain amount of high confidence index. But I can't really go subcortical. But I did not expect that. The reason I show these things is because watching people suddenly brighten up and engage or suddenly relax. So he has chronic pain. He's got bursitis in one of his shoulders, a lot of tension. Watching his shoulders come down, and then after about maybe 10, 15 minutes after we ran it, he was like, my shoulder doesn't hurt as much. Again, unexpected. I wasn't expecting that to help with pain. I think part of it was genuinely just the relaxation. But for him to physically relax and then engage, that was super interesting to me. This wasn't a long-term hold because it was like a 1 session. I asked him later, I would say the effects lasted probably about 3 days, which honestly, again, was way longer than I was expecting. He said about 3 days. The talkativeness went away after a few hours, but the general relaxation, he told me the next 2 days at work, he found himself oddly less homicidal than usual when people asked him where things were in the grocery section, was how he phrased it, if I remember correctly. And I was like, that sounds like a positive improvement. Again, this was not a permanent change, but I was a little surprised at the level of change and then what I was seeing in the EEG. I actually have another round. I've got about 15 or 20 people that I have been working with. I've been working with for about roughly 15 to 20 years, and they've all signed paperwork. And they are my actual guinea pigs. So they come in and they only do things that I want to test out. I try to choose things that I think will actually be helpful for them, but they don't do long-term neurofeedback. They don't do anything else in between. They're not on meds. They come in and they're as close as I can get to sort of a control for trying things. Because the thing that's really confounding, understandably, and I've done tons of data gathering like in clinical treatment, but you're doing clinical treatment, you're throwing everything at it, you're trying to make the person better. Make the person better, obviously, is the intent for everything, but having a brain that doesn't have a lot of other stuff going on, introduce something into. So he's one of the people, I'll space it out minimum a few weeks before I'll do anything repetitive, but I probably pull him in like every 2 to 3 months and just run a couple things. And I've got like a handful of people I do that on. And there's benefits for everybody for that. And they've signed paperwork saying I can use their stuff but he's not in treatment. There's a variety of reasons, not just me saying, oh, you would be more useful as a guinea pig. Like, I'm not like that. But there are reasons why he doesn't really want to do ongoing treatment, but he is interested in the idea of using his brain for science. So I've got people like that who I just pull as naive indicators. Part of the reason that I'm mentioning him is because this is another photobiomodulation only, but this was the early precursors of those protocol cascades. This was on the Neuro Pro 1, and what I did was I made a couple of protocol designs and just sequenced them together. So this little 10 minutes of alpha, which was essentially, so this is an earlier Neuro Pro, so it only had 1 intranasal, and it had 6 transcranial. That was this little one that I had the pictures of. The 1 intranasal, the 6 across the head, and then like that little extra cerebellum placement. This was a 10 minutes of alpha where we did like a kind of an alpha power up. This was a couple minutes of just intranasal cerebellum, like what I showed you right before. A couple minutes where we added in that PZ, and then a few more minutes where we added in the full parietal, and then the whole head for a couple minutes. So this was a 10-minute kind of bottom-up alpha generator. Then so that was like an opener. Then I made like a 7-minute for the back end, where I did something similar where I, started full parietal, went down to just PZ, and then just went down. So this was a 7-minute kind of like alpha down. And then, so I used those as bookends, and then I made 2 other protocols with stuff in between. One protocol was looking at that the 2 blue ones were synced together, and the 2 red ones were synced together. And then this was a 12 to 18 hertz sweep. So over about 13 minutes, we literally spent a minute in each frequency, 12 hertz, 13 hertz. So this was like kind of like a low beta range across the sensory motor cortex chiastic sweep. So they both, like all 4 of these spent a minute in each frequency from 12 to 18 hertz, but the red ones were diagonally synced and the blue ones were diagonally synced. And the purpose for this was try to create some cross hemispheric sort of sensory motor integration. And then the other one that I made was the gamma protocol. It was just full head gamma sweep for 13 minutes of 37 to 42 hertz, just 1 minute at each frequency up, and just all of the ones in the middle were just all vibing in gamma. So then what I did was I linked them up together. So that 10 minutes of alpha up, the 12 to 18 chiastic sweep, and then the alpha down was flow. And the point of that was to create that alpha base get him in that state flexibility, and then really lean into that sensory motor strip communication, because there is a lot of peak performance and body comfort and intelligence and response that comes from having an integrated sensory motor strip. And then the other one I made was expand, precursor to enhance, which was alpha up, gamma sweep, and then that alpha, kind of that alpha down closer. So I'm showing you this because these were those early versions. And then I took this same guy several months later and ran him through the expand. So remember, I was like, well, he responded like that to alpha. His gamma went all over the place. What was all that? So I made some notes. I pulled him back in a couple months later. I was like, I'm going to run this one on you. We're going to start off with that alpha. It was like, this is the sequence. We're going to give you like that 10 minutes of alpha. We're going to do a gamma sweep, and then we're going to do the alpha down, and then I'm going to map you. So that's what we did. And it was interesting. This is the concept of like a protocol cascade. I had him come in and do it. And then I had him do it again, same exact thing, 2 days later, because that then allowed for me to get me that second baseline and then see what happened the second time. 2 days later, repeat. So I ran it. So I did a baseline, ran it. 5 minutes after I ran that, roughly 30 minutes of the alpha, gamma, alpha, and then I did a 30-minute one. So this is a high-level summary. Here's what was interesting. So this was basically his betas. This was like 21 to 40 hertz, okay? So when you guys are looking at these little red spots, I ran that on him. This was 5 minutes later, and this was 30 minutes later. And you guys will notice that there was not a lot of dramatic change right after, but there was more noticeable shifting 30 minutes later. 2 days later, I did another one, and here's what I think I kind of want you to notice that I pulled out of that for me. Remember, I was saying that sometimes you will see increases and decreases locally, but sometimes you'll see the movement, you'll see activity move from one part of the brain to a different part of the brain. Those are the two things we see the most often. So you will notice that in his baseline, we had kind of this little like right frontal thing happening and a smidge of parietal. You'll notice that 30 minutes later, we're seeing less of that focal frontal finding and more distinctly parietal movement. 2 days later, we do that other baseline, and look how that frontal stuff, that really kind of identified distinct, almost like F4, that didn't come back. That did not come back, and the finding that's kind of most noticeable, again, this little left, I feel like I can make an argument that this is genuine beta, and I also feel like mixed in with that was a little bit of jaw tension. So I'm not really leaning into this left temporal finding here. I'm not going to camp on that for now. I think there was some fast frequency, but I didn't like it. It was a little messy. What was very clear was this parietal finding. So when we left off after our first session, we had this kind of shift over to the parietal, come back in, a lot of that frontal disfocal stuff is gone, and then 5 minutes later, 30 minutes after, that parietal finding was very distinct. This is the same setup. These are 2 days. Both times I did a baseline, ran that expand, 30 minutes, alpha, gamma, alpha. Then 5 minutes after I ran it, I did a second baseline, and then I waited 30 minutes and I did another one. So this was the first day I did it. This was the second day I did it. This is delta. This is delta behavior. We had this right front delta. After the first run through, it shifted to the back. So we really kind of went from right frontal to parietal, stayed parietal, and then we come back 2 days later, and not only are we still hanging out in the parietal, but we have actually gone up about a half a standard deviation. So we've got 3 standard deviations of beta in that parietal. We did expand again, dropped down to about 2.2, and then this is what's super interesting to me. It dropped geographically from high parietal down to basically the posterior cingulate. He's got a whiplash injury. Remember, he had that coup contra coup? We saw that shift, like diagonally, but he's got a coup contra coup, he has some whiplash. Remember that coup contre coup? So he came in, we did that little nasal cerebellum. Remember how we saw that shift kind of from the left rear to the right front? This is his baseline. Remember, delta's where we do repair. He came in a couple months later. Look how his delta's hanging out in that right front after we left it a couple months prior. It's still hanging out. It's doing something. We do a little bit more photobiomodulation, nothing else. We've done that one session that we did that little pre-post. And now we're doing like this little expand session, right? So we've got this baseline. He shifts from that right frontal. In the first session, he shifts back to parietal. Parietal. You'll notice there's a little bit of drift. See this little yellow down here? There's a little bit of drift. 2 days later he comes in and he is just working overtime, top to bottom of the back of the head. He has shifted back. He said spent 2 days repairing something. We do the alpha gamma alpha again. So what it did was it was the 10 hertz. Remember we went through the stages, but then in between the two alphas was the 37 to 42 hertz sweep. Now it was hanging out full back of the head. We do it again, and it starts to kind of like vocalize, and then that thing just drops down to the posterior cingulate. I have spent so much time reading brain injury literature, being a recovering soccer enthusiast and a motorcyclist who's dumped myself a few times. I've had a number, the occasional bar fight, I've had a number of knocks to the head. And so I'm always quite interested in like the longevity, like how long the brain will stay in repair mode, and then what allows it to change and speed up and reintegrate. And so knowing he has a history of head injury and watching this type of movement in the delta, that was so interesting to me, especially because he told me the couple of months, he did that original one, he felt more relaxed, he felt less homicidal. This little extra slowing in that right frontal, remember right frontal is kind of novelty and avoidance, and left frontal is more kind of like a approach. So approach and avoidance. And so that's why people have like a lot of 10 hertz, a lot of alpha in the left frontal. We're like, well, that's depression. Well, what it means is you're stuck in, I'm here and I'm aware, but I'm not engaging. So a lot of alpha, not a lot of fast frequency in the left frontal means, you're there, but you're not really initiating stuff. So that's why we correlate it with depression. But right frontal is avoidance and novelty and a handful of other social anxiety things. His right frontal cortex was just kind of hanging around in, I would say it wasn't really engaged, which if it wasn't really engaged in avoidance, he was less avoidy, which, we're kind of going around in a circle trying to logic the chain out, right? But he told me, he was like, in the last couple of months, he was like, I haven't been as like reactive and irritable. So like that right frontal slowing, which I would probably look at out of context and be like, ooh, this isn't like fantastic for you operationally. His brain was like, how about we just reduce whatever the primary stressors are? And right now it's the fact that I work in a grocery store and have to interact with people all of the time. And that makes me very upset and stressed because I don't enjoy it. He just slid that delta over there and was like, we'll work on coup contre coup and we'll chill out the reactivity. So he was like, I've actually been more chill the last couple of months. So I do this, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, let's do the thing. We see it shift to parietal. We see it go from high parietal down to posterior cingulate, like really sort of more brainstem. I know he's got that brain injury. I know he's got that reactivity. And I know that he's easily overstimulated. What does the parietal cortex do? So all your sensory inputs come in, sensory motor, auditory through the temporals, visual through the occipital. Parietal sits right in the middle of all those primary sensory processing inputs. It takes everything and it integrates all of those together, and then it checks in with the frontal cortex and says, what do you want to pay attention to? So now we've shifted delta to the parietal cortex. It can't live there forever. You really need the integration capabilities of the parietal cortex, or you will get overwhelmed and overstimulated and very non-functional. It hung out in the parietal cortex and then it dropped down to repair posterior, like basically brainstem connections, because the posterior cingulate is a shortcut between the limbic structures and the parietal cortex. anterior cingulate, shortcut between limbic, frontal cortex. And so he's sitting here, and so after this, he told me the 2 days in between, he felt like he had a little trouble processing stuff that was like happening around him. We did it again 2 days later, and he told me the next month or two, he was like, my processing speed was much faster. He was like, I got less overwhelmed. He was like, it's very interesting because I wasn't as disconnected and indifferent to people interacting with me as I was those couple of months in between. He was like, I did feel pretty indifferent. He was like, I didn't feel indifferent anymore. Remember that front right delta was gone? He was like, I didn't feel indifferent anymore. He was like, but I also wasn't as reactive. So he got a little bit more engaged. The delta moved. He was like, but I did notice I didn't go back up to previous when I was very kind of almost emotionally reactive. So him telling me, like, here's how it felt. Here's what happened in the 2 days where like I almost felt like my parietal cortex was a little bit blunted. I had more trouble integrating, like these weren't the words he was using. And then, we did it again and he was like, that went away. And so he's talking to me about, like, he's sort of narrating his experience. And I say talking to me, obviously I'm asking him like 37 questions. But I have a number of cases like this where I've been able to go in and just do multiple maps, look at the movement, and then ask them questions in a somewhat intervention naive environment where we're pretty sure that whatever responses they're having clinically should be related to the intervention. $10 and $40 options. Personal opinion, doing the STIM before, like doing the photobiomodulation before the neurofeedback is probably your best option for creating that little power up to then do the neurofeedback. Quick and simple. How do you pick which one? Me calling 10 hertz state flexibility and relaxation and 40 hertz processing speed and complex tasking is a wild simplification. But it's the rough frame that I use to make decisions about what is it I think that they're dealing with, and what am I trying to help, what state am I trying to help them be in when I introduce the neurofeedback. So for people who are kind of high rev, I'm almost always going to give them that 10 hertz and then do the neurofeedback, because what I'm hoping to do is increase to some degree that state flexibility so that they can calm down a little bit. I'm trying to pull them a little out of that fast frequency and make it possible for them to learn without being as kind of resistant. But I also think the 10 hertz could work for people who are very slow. So if you've got someone with a lot of significant slowing, like maybe a lot of frontal brain injury, super slow delta, I think 10 hertz would also be a better option for someone like that if we're trying to engage. Because you stick 40 hertz on top of like an excessive 5 hertz activity, I think it might be too far to really create the movement if we've got someone who's very compromised. Doesn't mean it couldn't, but that's probably not what I would go for. So if I've got very anxious and maybe really compromised, 10 hertz is almost always going to be what I do. For people who are coming in, and I would consider them to be reasonably functional, less compromised, but they're coming in for what we would call maybe more cognitive concerns. Memory, focus, multitasking, can't get it together at work, that kind of thing. I would almost always go for the 40 hertz. Because if there's any medication that you could train through, it's a stimulant. In fact, some people do better neurofeedback on caffeine or a little SSRI or, a little dexamphetamine. The idea is, do I have someone who's already a little bit all over the place and what they need is organization? So there's a difference between pegged out anxiety and unmoderated engagement. So if someone's like, I've got ADD, I'm all over the place, I don't feel emotionally upset other than how my ADD is screwing up my life. If I've got someone who doesn't have like a strong emotional distress component, 40 hertz is a really natural go-to because we're trying to put that organization on top, but we're also engaging that dual inhibition for increased learning capability, which is really what that neurofeedback is bringing to the table. if I've got somebody, so I'm almost always going to do it at the beginning. I think that there are similar principles for doing a little concurrent, if you want to toss a few electrodes on top of it and do it at the concurrent. When I do concurrent, I almost always do about 5 minutes of just photobiomodulation, and then I kick in the EEG. So if I want to do it at the same time, I still do a little opener, and then I kick in the EEG. If you want to mix them together, maybe do 1 or 2 sessions just photobiomodulation, 1 or 2 sessions just your neurofeedback protocol, and then put them together. Give the brain an opportunity to learn the discrete interfaces, and then layer them together. If I'm going to do 10 hertz with neurofeedback, I'm almost always trying to take advantage of that 10 hertz, like state flexibility or kind of like the alpha vibe. So people who I am working on, again, it's the same categories. People who I'm working on anxiety and insomnia, and I'm trying to create like maybe more alpha behavior, better alpha integration, like people who I'm trying to get relaxed and state flexible, and even the integration of trauma. Because remember, like alpha is the production behavior, it's kind of in between top fast frequency and bottom slow frequency. So I'm also looking for that integration capability. Alpha is fantastic for integration, like brain body. So people got history of physical trauma and they're having trouble with that disassociation, disintegration. You know, people are having trouble just generally feeling comfortable or grounded. If I'm gonna run my little alpha theta protocol or run my, like, whatever it is I'm trying to do that I think will be integrative and grounding, I would run the 10 hertz with that. If I'm looking more for executive function, peak performance, stuff like that, those protocols I would buddy up with that 40 hertz. I feel like this really is like a very simplistic way of doing it, but I mean, this is 90% of my decision-making process when I'm just kind of trying things out and then having people, because I do like a lot of, you know, like consulting and mentoring and stuff, and people are like, well, what do I try? These are basically the principles I give them, and we're seeing very, I would say reasonably consistent response rates, because we already kind of know what our neurofeedback protocol should do. We theoretically have an idea of what we're thinking that 10 or 40 hertz should introduce into the mix. So we're seeing genuinely kind of enhanced outcomes either sequentially or concurrently, simultaneously. We're seeing what I would consider to be reasonably consistent enhanced outcomes. Not consistent like everybody's brain's doing the same thing, but consistent as in we're seeing movement and response in a higher percentage or at a higher rate that makes sense to me in the context of what we think them together should be able to do.